When Jim Bridger was a young man, the entire western half of what's now the United States was, for lack of a better term, a wilderness. A land teeming with bison and ruled by indigenous hunter-gatherer societies. Untamed, untouched, and unsullied. Bridger would join the ranks of Ashley's 100 while still a teenager and, alongside other future legends like Hugh Glass, Jedediah Smith, and James Beckwourth, head up the Missouri River in search of beaver. From present-day northern Montana all the way down to the Gulf of California. From the Mississippi on west to the Pacific Ocean, Bridger saw it all, discovering and blazing trails that still bear his name to this day, while at the same time facing off with some of the deadliest warriors who ever strung a bow. Ah, but the shining times wouldn't last forever. By Jim's 35th birthday, the beaver trade done petered out. The West he called home was quickly being overrun by so-called civilization, and he found himself yet again adapting to a new way of life. Nevertheless, over 4 decades after first coming west, Bridger was still riding the prairie, scouting for the U.S. Army at 64 years of age. This series covers it all, from the rise and decline of the Mountain Men to Fort Bridger, the Utah War, the Donner Party, Jim's time as a guide for rich adventurers and government explorers, all the way up to Red Cloud's War and the Fetterman Massacre. From Ashley's 100 to the 100 in hand, we're taking a look at who Bridger really was as a person, his family, and finally, his legacy. We're going to the marrow of the world on this one, where elk don't know how many legs a horse got, where there ain't no laws for the brave ones or asylums for the crazy ones, and there ain't no priests setting the birds. By God, my name's Josh, and you're listening to the Wild West Extravaganza. James Felix Bridger was born on March 17, 1804 in Richmond, Virginia. His parents, James and Chloe, operated both a farm and an inn, but would move the family west in the year 1812. Not the safest of journeys, as not only was there a war going on with Great Britain, but the area they were headed was still, at that time, considered the frontier. They'd take Daniel Boone's Wilderness Road through the Cumberland Gap across the Appalachians onto the Ohio River, where they would then board a flatboat bound for Illinois territory. And brother, believe me when I say that the natives of the upper Missouri River Valley weren't too happy with American encroachers. This is at a time when people were still being slaughtered where the city of Chicago would one day stand. You had Blackhawks War to the north, the Winnebagos were raiding, even the Potawatomi led by an old boy named Mainpock. Nevertheless, the family settled at 6 Mile Prairie, just outside of St. Louis, and it's there that young Jim would spend the next decade of his life. Sadly, his mother would pass away in 1816 when James was just 12, his brother a few months later, and then his pops followed them both to the grave the following year, leaving just Jim and his sister. As such, a 13-year-old Bridger went to work on a ferry before being apprenticed to a famous gunsmith named Philip Creamer. Now, oftentimes you'll read that Jim was simply a blacksmith's apprentice, but that is quite the understatement. William Clark, John C. Calhoun, and Andrew Jackson were just some of the notable names who would come to own and love firearms crafted by Philip Creamer. Dude was very well known at the time and his talents were widely sought after, and it was under his tutelage that Jim would learn the craft as well. In 1817, Creamer, with Jim in tow, would travel 170 miles north to the Potawatomi Reservation, taking care of the tribe's gunsmithing and blacksmithing needs and giving Bridger his first exposure to life among the indigenous. Keep in mind that this was the same tribe his family guarded themselves from when he was a child. Now here he was living among them, seeing them as actual human beings with families and unique personalities. I think this experience went a long way into shaping Bridger's view of Native Americans in the years to come, as well as his way of interacting with them. Now, Jim did live with Creamer and his family, but he also spent time with an uncle, his father's brother, in Illinois town, now part of St. Louis. And of course, in February of 1822, a 17-year-old Bridger answered the famous advertisement ran in the Missouri Gazette, looking for 100 enterprising young men to follow the River Missouri to its source, and there be employed for 1, 2, or 3 years. This was William Henry Ashley's expedition, bound for the western wilderness in search of beaver. According to trappingtoday.com, top quality beaver pelts may get $25 or more this year, 2023, with northern collections likely averaging around $15 to $20. Beaver from most other places will probably continue to average in the $10 to $12 range. Now, I couldn't find out how much a pelt was worth in 1822, but by 1837, they'd get you about $2, which is the equivalent of over $60 in today's money. So, depending on quality, you're looking at beaver plumes being worth somewhere between 3 to 6 times as much as they are nowadays. And lest you think that this doesn't amount to much, well, America's first millionaire built his fortune on beaver. A guy named John Jacob Astor. By the way, you're going to hear me use the phrases pelts and plumes interchangeably during this series. A pelt is just another way of saying animal skin, fur included. Likewise with plu, a French bastardization that the trappers would use to describe the beaver skin or pelt. This is what they harvested from the beaver that they trapped. But why? What made beaver so valuable? It largely had to do with fashion, believe it or not. Beaver felt top hats were all the rage over in Europe, and as the trend found its way over to the United States, the demand went through the roof. Important to note that the fur trade did not begin with Jim Bridger and Ashley's 100. It had already been going on for a good 2 centuries, and this episode or series is not meant to be a definitive history of the North American fur trade. I'm just giving you a quick rundown just for a little context. Also, for you longtime listeners, you're going to have a little deja vu throughout this series, especially if you've listened to what I've done on Hugh Glass or Kit Carson. I do plan on covering more of these mountain men in the future, guys like Jed Smith and Jim Beckwourth and Joseph Walker, and I don't want to have to rehash the same old information each and every time. I know that could potentially be kind of boring. So just bear with me once more, and going forward for future topics, I'll use this episode or series as sort of a reference for new listeners. Cool? Cool. Now, the fur trade in North America really began in the early 1600s with the French in Newfoundland, Canada. They exchanged goods with Native Americans for pelts, and the practice soon spread. By the turn of the 19th century, the French-Canadian presence was heavy from the Great Lakes to the Canadian prairies, and even down into the Dakotas. Even the Russians got involved, exporting an average of 60,000 pelts a year from the Alaskan coast. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the Lewis and Clark expedition that followed opened up even more territory for the fur trade. By 1808, Andrew Henry established a post on the Three Forks of the Missouri, present-day Montana, but was soon driven away by the Blackfeet. He relocated his men near present-day St. Anthony, Idaho, for a short time, before heading back east and becoming preoccupied with the War of 1812. Once hostilities ceased, Ashley and Henry formed what would become known as the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, and placed that famous ad in the Missouri Gazette. So yeah, the fur trade was already well established long before 1822. John Coulter of the Lewis and Clark expedition stayed out west, trapping beaver in the present-day states of Montana and Idaho. Then you had Andrew Henry, even Manuel Lisa had his trading post on the mouth of the Bighorn by 1810. You could accurately say that what we consider the Mountain Man era really began with the Lewis and Clark expedition. I think that's technically true. I would argue, however, that it was kicked into overdrive with Ashley's 100 and the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. This was like a graduating class, a who's who when it comes to famous frontiersmen. Among those who answered Ashley's advertisement were Hugh Glass, Jedediah Smith, William Sublett, Jim Beckwourth, Ed Rose, Broken Hand Fitzpatrick, Davy Jackson, and yes, our very own teenage Jim Bridger. John Coulter may have been the original OG mountain man, but Ashley's 100 were about to define an entire era. By the way, they did not all head up the Missouri River in one bunch. There were 3 separate keel boats that departed St. Louis on 3 separate occasions. Andrew Henry led the first group, including Jim Bridger, as they pushed off on April 3, 1822, their boat piloted by the notorious Mike Fink. And if you're not familiar with Mike Fink, he was already a very well-known figure on the river, who's often referred to as the king of the keelboatmen. A tough brawler and heavy drinker who Davy Crockett once allegedly described as part horse and part alligator, Fink would have already been about 50 years of age at this time. Now, full disclosure, I feel like I'm duty-bound to point out that we can't prove the Mike Fink who went upriver with Henry and Bridger was the same famous Mike Fink riverboat captain. Hugh Glass, who was just in his early 40s, was known as Old Hugh, yet nobody seems to have made any remarks on Fink's even more advanced age. Then again, if it wasn't the riverboat Mike Fink, then that would be one hell of a coincidence. I mean, what are the odds there just so happened to be another hard-fighting, heavy-drinking killboat captain with the balls to head into the mostly unknown? Killboats, by the way, predated steamboats, and since these men were traveling upriver and going against the current, they powered these vessels with pure muscle. Men on both sides would walk from one end to the other, dropping long poles in the water until hitting the river bottom, and then heave against the poles, over and over and over. Grueling work that, according to one account, would see each man take more than 4 million steps from bow to stern on their way to the Yellowstone. At other times, if conditions called for it, they waded in the water or along the banks pulling the boat by a long tow rope. Now, not everybody was on the boat. You also had a land party traveling parallel to the river. Each evening, the two groups would reunite, and each morning they'd resume their labor. By mid-July 1822, they reached present-day South Dakota, where they fell on lean times. Game was scarce, and it was considered a lucky day if they happened upon a stray dog to roast. As a result, despite being deep in hostile territory and a long ways from civilization, there were a few desertions. Still, Bridger and the others pushed on, past the lands of the Arikara and Mandan and into the domain of the Assiniboine, who, as luck would have it, stole 25 horses from the expedition just as a way of saying hello. Horses that the men would need to take them into the mountains once they left the river. Finally, by August, they reached their destination, the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers, not far from present-day Beaufort, North Dakota, and just a stone's throw away from the present-day border with Montana. It was there that the men would erect Fort Henry, as they awaited Ashley and the others to join them. Once situated, it was time to go to work, and Ashley split the men into 3 groups. One would stay at Fort Henry and literally hold down the fort, while at the same time trading with any local tribes bringing in pelts. The other 2 groups, one led by Ashley and the other by a large Danish man called Weber, spelled Weber, but I believe it's pronounced Weber, would head out and set their own traps. I do not know which of these 3 Bridger was assigned to, but I'm next to certain that Jim brought in his first beaver plume that very season. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to make a confession. I have never personally engaged in any type of fur trapping. I will try my best to describe the beaver trapping process that these men of the expedition would have employed, as I understand it, but since I know I've got a few trappers listening right now, please feel free to email me with any corrections. WildWestExtra.com and hit that contact button. As a company man, Bridger would have to draw traps out from the clerk against his own account, for likely double what they would cost in St. Louis. He'd then head out and be on the lookout for beaver sign. Obviously, you have beaver dams, right? But it's the little things that Jim would soon learn to notice, like which beaver dams had fresh mud. Then you had your beaver slides, where the rodents would come in and out of the water. If it was winter, and much of the time it was, because that's when the beaver fur is at its thickest and most valuable, Bridger would search for where the ice was broken up, indicating fresh activity. He'd use all these clues to decide the most likely path of the beaver, and then place his set or traps. Bridger would have to wade into the freezing water and use a knife to cut a level bed in the bank about a half a foot or so under the surface, sort of a shelf to set his trap. A trap he'd bait with something called castor, an oil harvested from the sack near the beaver's muffler. The trap itself would be attached to a chain that he would then secure into the bed of the stream with a stake. I do not know how many traps Jim would have had at his disposal, nor do I know how often he'd catch beaver in relation to how many traps he'd set out. But I have read that some of these trappers would check their sets twice a day. Now, these traps in question would have been made of iron, double springed with 2 jaws that would slam shut if anything triggered the pan. They weighed anywhere between 6 to 8 pounds, and I imagine your average fur trapper would maybe carry 6 to 10 of them on his person. As with any job, with time came experience and knowledge. Those first couple of winters out west, Bridger would have picked up quickly on all the little tricks of the trade. He would also learn a thing or two about keeping his scalp, but we'll get to that soon enough. Once Jim collected his traps and the dead beavers, it was time to skin them and flesh them. At this point, the hide would then be stretched onto a circular hoop, usually made out of willow, and let dry. Now, all of this, of course, would be done back at camp, and once accomplished, the clerk would credit Jim for his half of the value of the furs to pay off any of the company debt that he had thus far accumulated in the way of traps and supplies, which I guess is how they get you. And on it went, day in, day out. As much as we romanticize these mountain men, they were first and foremost out there to trap beaver. They had a job to do, and I'm pretty sure Ashley didn't offer paid time off, sick days, or time and a half after 40 hours. Now, just to set the scene a little more, I think it's beneficial to look at how isolated these men would have been from what they considered civilization. At this time, in 1822, there was essentially nothing west of St. Louis, Missouri. I mean, sure, you had the Spanish and Mexican settlements down in Texas and New Mexico, and over in California. You had the French Canadians up in the Great White North, and you even had a few Brits on the West Coast in present-day Oregon. But the vast interior of what's now the United States. Okay, the entire area is consistent of Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, damn near all of Washington and Oregon. There was nothing. And by nothing, I mean no towns, no forts, no stores, no churches or schools or restaurants. They simply did not exist. Not to say that the land wasn't populated. It was, by hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples. And these people had their own special cultures, with religion and artwork and traditions, rich cultures. I'm not trying to denigrate them or say that they weren't a civilization or make them appear less than. But for the American fur trappers, this was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Okay, there was no readily available access to manufactured goods or medical care or anything like that. To quote author Jerry Insler, these men had no shelter other than what they built, no food except what they hunted, and no protection except what they could provide themselves. They'd have to adapt and become like their new indigenous neighbors if they had any hopes of acclimating to this wild new land. And believe it or not, despite landing on starving times on their way there, that first winter of 1823, they would eat pretty well. And you better believe they were eating the majority of what they killed, not just what we nowadays consider the choicest cuts. These men dined on it all: the hearts, livers, tongues, the hump fat from the buffalo, even the marrow. One fur trapper's specialty was to turn the buffalo intestines inside out and add in tiny bits of organ meat. This was about as close to a carnivore diet as you could get. I can't speak to the specifics of Bridger and his companions, but during parts of the Lewis and Clark expedition, not far from this same area, they were ingesting an average of 9 pounds of meat per day per man. So around 6,000 calories, and still going to bed hungry. Part of this was due to all that lean meat, hence the supplementing with the liver and heart and as much fat as they could get their hands on. Also, the organ meat, whether they knew it or not, helped to ward off scurvy. You may have heard that the old mountain men considered beaver tail to be a delicacy. This is true, but once again, this points to their diet of lean meat coupled with a ton of physical exertion, more than it does the culinary delights of beaver tail. It's pretty much just all fat and gristle, but that's exactly what these men were craving. The good times wouldn't last forever, though. As you'll soon hear throughout the majority of this series, the great nemesis of the Rocky Mountain fur trappers were the Blackfeet, a powerful nation that, in their heyday, controlled a vast swath of territory. I'm talking like from present-day Edmonton, Alberta, down to Yellowstone, from Glacier National Park in northwestern Montana all the way east, damn near to the Black Hills of South Dakota. This is the tribe that attacked John Colter and made him do his famous run for his life back in 1808. And it's the same folks who took out some of Henry's men in the Three Forks that following year. Likewise with these new uninvited guests. The Blackfeet would strike hard, killing 4 of Henry's men in the spring of 1823. And if such formidable warriors weren't enough to worry about, some of the trappers took to fighting one another. Mike Fink, the killboat captain, killed a man named Carpenter as the two were drunkenly shooting cups of whiskey off each other's heads. In turn, one of Carpenter's buddies, Talbot, unloaded his pistols into Fink, killing him. As for Talbot, he would soon drown while crossing the Teton River. And then disaster really struck. In June of 1823, Ashley sent a contingent of men to trade with the Arikara for desperately needed horses. Not a great idea, as the Arikara were all kinds of riled up, and for a myriad of reasons. First of all, they relied heavily on trade. With Ashley's men trapping beaver all on their own, it sort of cut the Arikara out as the middlemen. Then there was the trading post that they were promised but never received, thus depriving them of easily obtaining manufactured goods, the sort of stuff that their enemies had access to. And on top of all that, some members of the Missouri Fur, a rival trapping company, had recently killed 2 Arikara. They were plumb fed up and decided to take their anger out on Ashley's men. Now, I spoke more in depth about this on the episode I did on Hugh Glass, but I'll briefly cover it again now. Ashley was initially able to trade for 19 horses, and that evening he split his party in 2. One group, led by Jedediah Smith, stayed on shore to camp out with the newly acquired mounts, with plans to drive the small herd overland to Fort Henry the next day. Ashley and the rest of the men stayed on the kill boat about 30 yards from the bank, likewise planning to pull it back to the fort. Both parties would have to wait for a fierce windstorm to die down before they could depart, and this delay would prove to be disastrous. 2 of the men on shore, Edward Rose and Aaron Stevens, got that peculiar feeling that us men are prone to get from time to time, and decided to stroll on over to the Arikara camp looking to, well, partake in that oldest profession known to man, if you know what I mean. and in the process, Stevens went and got himself killed. Around midnight that night, some Arikara swam to the kill boat and tried to get inside the cabin, forcing Ashley to chase them off with a pistol. At about that same time on shore, Rose comes running back to camp, hollering up a storm about Stevens. After some debate, the men on the bank decided just to stay put and wait till first light to make a move. Obviously, they were on high alert. Right at the ass crack of dawn, the Arikara approached and said that they would trade him Stevens' body for one horse. The horse was provided, and a few minutes later, the Arikara claimed that there was not enough of Stevens left to return. Yikes. At this point, the fight was on as both sides started trading fire. A battle you can see dramatized in the opening scene of 2015's The Revenant. Just in case you were wondering why they were hollering to get to the boat, well, now you know. All total, 14 trappers would be killed and around 10 wounded before they could make their escape. Without the damn horses, by the way, and minus a boat and over 30 guns. Now, Jim Bridger was not present for this fight, but when Jed Smith hauled ass up to Fort Henry for reinforcements, Jim was one of the men who returned with him, and he would take part in the short Arikara War that followed. As Bridger and the reaction force were headed downriver, Ashley sent the wounded back to St. Louis along with a bunch of letters seeking help. To that end, the commander of Fort Atkinson, Colonel Henry Leavenworth, soon came running with 230 men of the 6th U.S. Infantry. These soldiers, the first ever to be deployed against hostile Native Americans west of the Mississippi, were joined by 50 volunteers from the Missouri Fur Company, the damn scoundrels that started this whole mess, 80 of Ashley's men, and 500 mounted Lakota warriors, bringing their ranks to damn near 900. They were armed and headed straight for the Arikara, looking to set things right. It turned out a bit anticlimactic, however. After a few brief skirmishes, Leavenworth called a ceasefire and parleyed with the Arikara leaders. As a treaty was being negotiated, the Lakota quit in disgust and went back home. After all, they didn't come all that way just to sit around and flap their gums. Later that night, the Arikara left as well, slipping out under the cover of darkness. The fur trappers, still not satisfied, went into the abandoned village and burned it to the ground, ensuring further bloodshed and revenge killings in the years that followed, as well as making the Missouri no longer a safe or viable travel option. As a result, the trappers would be forced to leave the river and head overland to access the Rockies. One group, once again led by Jed Smith, would head immediately towards the land of the Opsaluka, Crow Country. The other, piloted by Andrew Henry, would return to the fort and shut it down before linking up with Smith. We don't know for sure which group Bridger was part of, but as this was when the whole Hugh Glass bear mauling incident occurred, many believe Bridger was a member of Ashley's team. And if you don't know who Hugh Glass is, oh boy, are you in for a treat. Do yourself a favor and give that episode I did on Hugh a listen, link in the show notes. Or just Google the guy, it's one hell of a tell. The movie The Revenant was based on Glass, but you know how that goes. Hollywood is Hollywood, right? Once again, we've got a bit of overlap here, so I'm not going to rehash the incident in full, but the quick and dirty of it is that Glass was horribly mauled by a mama grizzly. By the time his fellow trappers got to him, he was still alive, but barely. They treated Hugh's wounds as best they could and made him as comfortable as possible as they waited for him to give up the ghost. Only thing is, Glass was taking his own sweet time and dying. Finally, Henry made an executive decision. He'd leave 2 men with the dying Glass with orders to bury him as soon as he expired, and then come skedaddling to join up with the others. The 2 trappers left were a guy named John Fitzgerald and presumably our very own Jim Bridger. They waited a few days, Glass still didn't die, so the pair abandoned their wounded compadre and made off with his rifle and other supplies, while the getting was still good. Now granted, they truly believed that Hugh was gonna die no matter what. I mean, the dude was horribly mangled. But still, they did leave him to die alone, and without a burial. Well, the tough old Hugh Glass just kept on breathing. He began to crawl at first, and then stumble, and then walk. Naked, emaciated, unarmed, and covered in maggots, Glass made his way on foot 250 miles to Fort Kiowa, present-day southern South Dakota. Unlike in the movie The Revenant, Glass was not looking for revenge, but he was dead set on getting that prized rifle back, which he did. He also had a come-to-Jesus meeting with young Bridger, or so the story goes, but ultimately forgave him for his youth and because he knew Jim was very hesitant to leave him behind, unlike that son of a bitch Fitzgerald. The big question among historians is whether or not this was really our Jim Bridger. And honestly, I'm no historian or anything, but I'm torn on this one as well. On one hand, the only evidence seems to hinge on what an aspiring author by the name of Edmund Flagg wrote some 16 years after the fact. He claimed that a youth of 17 named Bridges, not Bridger, Bridges, was who stayed back with Fitzgerald. Now, of course, this could simply be a spelling error, but Flagg also got many other facts wrong in regard to Glass's ordeal. Furthermore, researchers have discovered at least 7 men named Bridges working on or around the Missouri at the same time. That said, a whopping 8 decades after the bear attack, former steamboat pilot Joseph LaBarge said that he remembered a, quote, tradition that Jim Bridger was the young deserter, end quote. LaBarge's biographer, however, discounted this allegation, writing, quote, "There is no other proof of it than this intangible tradition. Who the young man was is not known," end quote. And the only record of Bridger addressing the issue that I'm aware of comes from James Stevenson, a scientist with the Geological Survey who spent a good deal of time with Jim in the late 1850s. When asked about it, Stevenson wrote, quote, "Bridger told me the story of your Glass, but there was no desertion," end quote. And make of that what you will. As far as I'm concerned, the verdict is still out. I feel like if it was Jim Bridger, then there would have been more of a mention of it from other famous trappers who were around during that same time. Then again, it's always possible that they kept their mouths shut out of respect. Bridger was certainly not shunned after Hugh Glass's mauling, nor did his alleged role in the desertion seem to hurt his reputation among the boys. Once Andrew Henry and the others linked up with Smith and his party, they'd build a new Fort Henry in present-day Montana, where the Yellowstone and Bighorn rivers meet. And luckily for them, their new neighbors, the Crow, were much more hospitable than the Blackfeet and Arikara. Not only would the trappers obtain desperately needed horses from the Apsalaga, but they would also winter with them, using the Crow village as sort of a base of operations as they fanned out in search of beaver. Even traveling as far away as the Wind River Valley in present-day Wyoming, where they would, air quotes, discover the South Pass. And I say air quotes because, let's face it, when we're talking about the fur trappers and their discoveries, the stuff they were finding had already been well known to the indigenous for centuries. Hell, it was the Crow who told them about the South Pass. Usually what we mean, or I guess what I mean, in the context of U.S. history when we're talking about somebody discovering something, we're really saying the first white Americans or Europeans to see or utilize a certain location or landmark. And in this case, that's still incorrect because Scottish-born Canadian fur trapper Robert Stewart took the same pass a dozen years prior. When it comes to the South Pass, however, it would be Ashley and his men that were successful in getting it on the map. Our very own Jim Bridger would cross the pass sometime towards the end of winter under the leadership of John Weber and trap beaver along the Green River of what's now southwestern Wyoming, which at that time belonged to Mexico. Of course, nobody told that to the Shoshone. They were willing to trade with the fur men for guns and other goods, but they also made no qualms in taking what they wanted by force, killing at least 13 trappers in the months to follow. And just to show you how young and somewhat inexperienced Jim still was at this time, he would get docked a large chunk of his pay that winter for killing a company mule. He was in camp one night, he heard a noise, thought he saw eyes flashing, and he raised his rifle and pulled the trigger. Whoops. Now this would be Bridger's second winter away from so-called civilization. The exposed skin on his face and hands would be burnt to a dark brown, his hair uncut, and his beard, well, he likely didn't have a beard. And neither did any of his companions. I know when we think of the Rocky Mountain fur trappers, we automatically think about, a bearded Jeremiah Johnson lookalike, but the fact was, Ashley had strict rules against facial hair. He had this weird idea that the natives wouldn't trust or trade with anybody that wasn't clean-shaven. Now, this rule didn't apply to free trappers and would eventually be relaxed for Ashley's men as well. But early on in 1822 and 23, it's very likely that all these guys would have been sans beards. Any vestige of city clothes that Bridger once owned would have been long gone, however. His attire now, and for many years to come, would largely mirror that of the Native Americans he lived amongst. Moccasins and long buckskin shirts, leather leggings, and buffalo robes replaced calico shirts and woolen pants. To be confused with an Indian was about the highest praise you could have paid one of these men. Don't get it twisted, though, there was not a universal or official uniform when it came to the mountain men. Each fur trapper had their own unique sense of swag, their own fashion sense, one that was influenced by a variety of different cultures. Unfortunately, we did not have cameras available in the 1820s to document these outfits, but you can get a decent idea by checking out the paintings of Alfred Jacob Miller. The artist would travel west in the late 1830s and attend at least one of the annual fur trapping rendezvous, where he captured their likeness on canvas. Both Old Bill Williams and Joseph Walker were painted dressed in heavily fringed buckskin from noggin to heel, with Williams wearing beaded moccasins and some sort of leather cap adorned with what appears to be colorful feathers. Did these guys ever don store-bought clothes? Yes, of course, at least when available. If you've ever seen any photos of Bridger as an older man, he looks much more like an unassuming farmer than anything else. But in those early years, especially before the annual rendezvous began, it was next to certain that Jim, other than maybe a Hudson's Bay blanket or a colored sash, would have been clad entirely in animal skins. He would have also carried a possibles bag, sort of like a satchel, in which he kept all the little things he needed in day-to-day operations. Sort of a mountain man version of a modern-day EDC. This is where he'd keep his flint and steel, lead balls, his patch, maybe his powder, and something to measure the powder with. Maybe a powder horn was also on his person. Tobacco if he had any. Bridger would have had a knife on him for sure, but it weren't no Bowie knife. The most popular blade among the fur trappers by far was just your average run-of-the-mill butcher knife. Maybe you or somebody you know has an old Hickory brand butcher knife in the kitchen. I know I've got a couple myself. This is a great example of what Bridger would have carried his first 10 plus years out west. Now later on, the Green River knives would become extremely popular on the frontier, but not until the 1840s. There's also a very good chance that Jim would have had a tomahawk. As far as other tools that could also be used as weapons, he and the rest of Ashley's fur trappers would have been carrying flintlock rifles, at least in the early 1820s. Matter of fact, General Ashley had commissioned the Hawken brothers in St. Louis, Jacob and Samuel, to custom build rifles for his men, rifles sometimes now referred to as Super Hawkins. Not a whole lot of details available on these bad boys other than they had 42-inch long barrels and they probably shot a 69 caliber ball. As to other rifles utilized by the fur trappers in the 1820s, the good old Kentucky long rifle reigned supreme. Also known as the Pennsylvania rifle, these flintlocks generally shot between a mid-30 to 45 caliber ball. And speaking of the Hawken brothers, their famous Hawkins rifle was also very popular among the mountain men, as shown in the movie Jeremiah Johnson. Speaking of Jeremiah, a very cool example of a Hawkins rifle can be found in the Cody, Wyoming Firearms Museum. They have what's claimed to be Liver Eaton Johnson's 56 caliber Hawken. It's much shorter than a Kentucky rifle and with a heavier barrel and larger caliber. They also have a pistol that allegedly once belonged to Jedediah Smith. Not sure about the provenance of these claims, but it is of the type that Bridger would have carried early on, an English-made flintlock with a 62 caliber bore. Keep in mind that these were all black powder one-shot firearms. There were no lever-action Winchester or Henry rifles back in the mountain man days, nor did the trappers have revolvers. Aside from a double-barreled shotgun, which they did have, everything else was single-shot. And that rifle didn't stay in no scabbard either. You rode with it in front of you, resting across your saddle. Hopefully you had a brace of pistols as well, but that's only 3 shots and you better be able to reload really damn fast or hope you're close enough to put that tomahawk of yours to use. Now all this is purely speculation based on the historical evidence. I did not find anything written in stone that said, hey, this is the exact rifle that Jim Bridger favored. I did find some hinting to the idea that Bridger personally carried a Creamer rifle that he himself helped to build with his mentor Philip Creamer. And it's said that Jim carried a Hawken for many a year. In the early 1850s, a business partner of Bridger's gifted him with an engraved 40 caliber half-stock Ogden rifle. Whether or not Jim ever carried this gun on his person or he kept it as a keepsake, I don't know. And later on in this series, I will describe another type of rifle that Bridger was seen carrying on the Great Plains in the early 1860s. So there you go. A reliable gun, a good knife, some powder, lead, tobacco, a half-dozen traps, a buckskin jacket, and 2 big old balls, and brother, I hope you know how to swim because you about to be drowning in beaver. Now, fashion sense and arsenal notwithstanding, Bridger and his companions would continue to ply their trade, harvesting beaver. By the fall and winter of 1824 and 25, they were setting traps on the Bear River, which was proven to be quite the mystery. Seriously, check out the bear on a map if you get a chance. It even looks like a big squiggly question mark. Some of the trappers reckoned it could be the fabled Bonaventura River, rumored to be a water passage to the Pacific. Others disagreed, and it weren't long before wagers were being made. Finally, they talked young Bridger, now 20 years of age, into setting off alone and figuring out the bear's course. He did so on horseback, eventually following the river's winding path through the Bear River Canyon before emerging to the side of a great body of water, extending for miles. Dismounting and taking a sip, Jim was surprised to discover that the water was salty, and thus Utah's Great Salt Lake was discovered. Maybe. There was another guy by the name of Etienne Provost, a French-Canadian trapper out of Taos, who was in the same area just a tad bit earlier than Bridger, and he did see the lake from a distance. Now, Jim thought it was the damn Pacific Ocean. Provost, we don't know what he thought. No word on if he knew it was salty or not. Still, though, both men do sort of get dual credit when it comes to the discovery. To which the local Native Americans remarked, "Oh, that big lake over there that's salty that we've known about for 1,000 years?" Discoveries aside, turns out Bridger and his pals weren't alone. And as far as they were concerned, them there mountains weren't big enough for everybody. Especially not a bunch of damn Englishmen and Iroquois from the Hudson's Bay Company. Evidently, the land west of the Great Divide and north of the Arkansas River was jointly claimed by both England and the United States. And the Hudson's Bay men had concocted a plan to kill all beaver along a huge portion of this border, creating what they called a beaver desert, thus stopping the Americans from advancing further west. And if that sounds confusing, let's talk geography for a moment. In 1823, Mexico wasn't the Mexico that exists today. Back then, it also consisted of all of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and parts of Wyoming. Russia owned Alaska, and England had control over the Pacific Northwest, present-day Washington State, Idaho, and I think most of Oregon. The rest of the land in the interior belonged to the United States via the Louisiana Purchase, and then of course you had the regular states and such back east. And yeah, the damnable French up north. As far as the English go, I know it's kind of weird nowadays for us to think in terms of them being the enemy, despite their uppity ways and horrendous taste in food, but for many Americans in 1825, this was the case. Hell, the United States had fought a revolution against Great Britain just 50 years prior. Just 11 short years before Jim tasted that salty water, the British burned Washington to the ground. So you can imagine there weren't all that many fond feelings. The American trappers with Weber and Bridger rode into the British camp flying the Stars and Stripes and began buying the pelts for more than Hudson's Bay was offering. After a few threats and boasts, the British boss man, guy named Peter Ogden, rode away intact, minus several $100s worth of beaver plues and 23 men who deserted to join the Americans. Speaking of plues, you may be wondering to yourself how these fur trappers sold their product. I mean, there weren't exactly any buyers out there in the mountains other than them. And getting all them hard-earned pelts all the way from the Rockies across the Great Plains and to the market in St. Louis was not just time-consuming but dangerous as hell. What about all the supplies they'd need for another season? Gunpowder, tools, knives, traps, lead, trade goods. They'd have to haul all that back. This problem was solved in the summer of 1825 when Ashley took an overland caravan consisting of 50 supply-laden pack mules west, setting up a camp on Henry's Fork of the Green River near present-day McKinnon, Wyoming, for the first-ever mountain man's rendezvous. In other words, the market came to the mountains, allowing the fur trappers to stay out west and devote themselves to their profession year-round without worrying about taking several months off to travel to St. Louis and back. By the way, Bridger and his men did have the largest haul out of all the Rocky Mountain fur that year, with over 3,000 pounds of beaver plues. Another, by the way, that first rendezvous was a somewhat tame affair compared to the party that it would eventually become. There were only about 120 trappers in attendance in 1825, and I do not believe there was any alcohol present. Once business was handled, Jim Bridger was one of the men who guarded Ashley and his newly acquired beaver pelts on their way north to the Yellowstone River. The plan was to float the furs via bull boats to the Missouri, where General Henry Atkinson and a bunch of paddle wheel-powered keel boats awaited for the rest of the journey. I guess this was meant to be sort of a show of force for the Arikara. Be that as it may, they'd have to make it through Blackfeet country first, and sure enough, just like clockwork, Ashley, Bridger, and the rest were attacked, and the Blackfeet were successful in making off with all but 2 of their horses. Thankfully, the ever-faithful Jedediah Smith came to the rescue a couple of days later with more horses. That's when the Crow decided it was their turn to join in on the fun. Now, both the Crow and the Shoshone are 2 tribes often remembered as friends to the American fur trappers. And oftentimes that was true. As you'll soon hear on this series, Bridger dealt with both peoples extensively. He lived with both of them, traded with them, and in the case of the Shoshone, would eventually marry into them. That said, things didn't always go so smoothly. In this particular case, I was not able to ascertain a motive. Perhaps the Crow were somehow provoked by the trespassing mountain men, or maybe they simply wanted all them horses that Jed Smith had just delivered. Whatever the case, they attacked. Hostilities were short-lived, however. The next day, both sides kissed and made up, and the Crow ended up traveling with the fur trappers for the rest of the journey. Now, it was on this little sojourn that they came to a pass on the Bighorn River known as Bad Pass, in present-day southern Montana's Bighorn Canyon National Recreation Area. Ashley was thinking maybe this would be a shortcut that would allow them to float all the way to the Yellowstone, and young Bridger volunteered to scout it out and see what was on the other side. Sort of like he did with the Bear River, only this time his vessel would be a quickly tossed-together makeshift raft as opposed to a horse. And down the river Bridger went, through the treacherous canyon and over chute after chute of whitewater rapids before being belched out the other side. Thoroughly soaked, probably a little shaken, but still alive. Ashley figured that it probably would not be a great idea to float all them valuable pelts across those rapids, so the main party went ahead and took the roundabout trail. That summer, there was also a shift in power within the ranks of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Andrew Henry was out, opted to try his hand instead at lead mining. Ashley then offered the vacancy to Jedediah Smith, which he accepted, making him a partner in the company. Bridger's boss, John Henry Weber, didn't care for this decision and he quit in protest. Headed back to the settlements as William Sublett took his spot. Quick note on Weber. Utah's Weber River, Weber Canyon, Weber County, and even Weber State University are all named for this man. Now the spelling of his name is Weber, W-E-B-B-E-R, and Weber is how his modern descendants pronounce it. The German-born Weber, however, had a thick accent, and to the fur trappers, when he said his name, it sounded like a Weber. So Weber it was. Bill Sublett, born in 1798, was in his mid-20s, so just a few years older than Bridger, and it was under Sublett's command that Jim once again headed out to trap the Bear River and spend the freezing months near the salt lake that he helped discover. As the brigade settled in, it was business as usual. Each morning, the men would climb out of their robes and brave the ice-cold water as they set their traps, and during the day, they'd see to their pelts. There are so many other details that I wish I knew, though. Did they trap in pairs or small groups for safety? Did they sleep in shifts? Did they rotate hunting duties, or was there a dedicated hunter? Were they all fleshing and stretching their own plues, or was there a low man on the totem pole, or maybe even at this point some indigenous women living with them doing the quote-unquote camp chores? I don't know. I do know that there was always danger, and Jim and the others would have to keep their eyes peeled, as evidenced by a visit from the Bannock that winter. The raiders made off with 80 of the Rocky Mountain Fur Boys' horses, and Bridger, alongside his good friend and trapper in arms, Thomas Fitzpatrick, led a group in search of the thieves. This would be the first time either of these young men were recorded as taking on a leadership role within the company. Within a few days, they were able to locate the Bannock camp, and Bridger personally led some of the men on foot as Fitzpatrick and the remaining trappers opened up fire, allowing Jim and his bunch to stampede the herd and not only retrieve their horses, but several of the Bannock ponies as well. Jim Beckwourth was allegedly along for this little raid, and he claimed they killed 6 Bannocks without a trapper so much as receiving a scratch. But then again, Beckwourth was a notorious liar. Now, as far as I can tell, this area they were trapping in was mostly between the Great Salt Lake and Bear Lake, along the Bear and Cub rivers in a place they called Willow Valley. Fun fact. Well, not so fun for those involved, but at one point, the trappers dug out a cache to store their pelts. They dug deep and wide and made a pretty sizable hole when all of a sudden it began rumbling and caved in, burying a trapper named Marshall inside. He was believed to be dead, and, well, hell, he was already buried, so they just left him there, and from thenceforth referred to Willow Valley as Cache Valley, which is how present-day Cache County, Utah got its name. This mishap was quickly followed by another tragedy that nearly cost the friendship between the mountaineers and their neighbors, the Shoshone, or the Snakes as the trappers called them. A young Shoshone was out hunting wearing an antelope skin as a decoy, and got himself shot by one of the fur men who took him for a damn antelope. Worried that this would mean a war with the Shoshone, Bridger and the others quickly began packing up their gear with plans to vacate the area. One of the Shoshone chiefs noticed all the commotion and stopped by to ask why they were leaving. The trappers hemmed and hawed for a bit, but finally Fitzgerald confessed. He explained what had happened, and the chief merely shrugged it off. "If that's why you're worried, you can stay." The leader further commented that the hunter was a fool to use such a decoy, especially knowing that white men shoot at all they see. In the end, the mountain men gave the Shoshone a scarlet cloth to wrap up the body in, and that was that. Crisis averted. The trappers would circumnavigate the Great Salt Lake in a skin canoe that year, looking for an outlet. And just an FYI, skin canoes are not the same thing as skin flutes. Before the men knew it, it was once more time for summer rendezvous, which, as luck would have it, would be held right there in Cache Valley. And this time they had whiskey, the unpacking of which, according to Jim Beckwourth, quote, contributed not a little to the heightening of our festivities. The men would bring in even more furs that year, and Ashley formed a new partnership not only with Jed Smith, but David Jackson and William Sublett as well. They'd take over as operators of the company, with Ashley retaining his portion of the lucrative resupplying aspect of the business. Once trading was done and everybody drank their fill, it was time to go back to work. Old Jed Smith led a brigade of men west to trap and explore California, while Bridger joined Sublett and Jackson to go north to the beaver-rich land of the Blackfeet. And once again, Jim is moving up in the ranks. That season would find Bridger taking on a new responsibility, that of a brigade pilot. Right in point as the men ventured deeper into the heart of Blackfeet country, staking their lives and their fortunes once more on beaver. The Blackfeet Confederacy is made up of 4 bands: the Northern Pagan, the Southern Pagan, the Blood, and the Siksika. Per their tribal website, blackfeetnation.com, most Blackfeet currently living in the United States descend from the South Pagan who, during Bridger's time trapping beaver, would have called themselves Neetsitapi, the people. Of course, the mountain men had other names for them. Some I won't mention here, but one of the most popular was Bugs Boys, the Sons of Satan. Needless to say, there was no love lost between the American trappers and the Blackfeet, their beef going all the way back to the Lewis and Clark expedition. I wrote about this recently in my 100% free newsletter, wildwestjosh.substack.com, if you're interested. Link in the show notes. But on the return trip from the Pacific, the Corps of Discovery separated and Captain Lewis's group had a confrontation with the Blackfeet, just south of the Marias River on what's now the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. Long story short, 2 Blackfeet warriors were killed, and from that point forward, it seemed like it was open season on American fur trappers. Weren't long before the mountaineers started feeling the same way about the Blackfeet, and violence became a given anytime the 2 groups would meet. Mercy was rarely extended by either side. That said, the idea that these hostilities were solely based on bad feelings from the Lewis and Clark expedition is an oversimplification. The Blackfeet had grown used to trading with the Hudson's Bay Company for goods and supplies, especially firearms with which they could defend themselves against their many enemies who also had firearms. And their currency to purchase these guns was beaver. As the trappers began encroaching on their territory, the beaver population was decimated. Many areas were plumb trapped out by the 1840s, and if you'll recall from the last episode, Hudson's Bay was attempting to create a beaver desert. The Blackfeet, as formidable and mighty as they weren't just fighting the fur trappers for the sake of meanness. They were protecting a very valuable asset, the beaver, a currency that allowed them to secure arms to protect their loved ones. Also, this was their land, and the fact of the matter was these fur trappers were not invited. Just something to keep in mind. I know when discussing the mountain men, it's very easy to see the Blackfeet as these super violent assholes hell-bent on mayhem and death. I mean, that is how the fur trappers viewed them. But you gotta figure the Blackfeet felt the same way about them. And that's not even taking into account the various epidemics that these mountaineers unknowingly introduced to the Blackfeet. Diseases that would absolutely crush them in the years to come. We left off with William Sublett leading a brigade into Blackfeet country, piloted by none other than our very own Jim Bridger. Now, this pilot job wasn't so much to trailblaze a path or guide the other trappers, as it was a walking point type situation, or riding point, I should say. They saw Bridger roaming miles ahead of the main party alone, specifically looking for any signs of ambush or attack. The men trapped their way up to Pierre's Hole, present-day eastern Idaho, before moving into the Big Titties, aka the Grand Teton Mountains. And yes, those peaks were named by French trappers because they reminded them of big old tatas. I mean, what do you want me to say? I get it. Long nights up there in the high lonesome. The men of the brigade pushed through the Teton Pass and into Jackson's Hole. And there's probably a joke there, but I'm not going to make it. And from there onto Yellowstone Lake, where they were awed by the same wonders that modern-day tourists enjoy when visiting Yellowstone. the geysers and colored mud boiling up from the earth, and what the trappers called sulphurous flames. The mountaineers spent the winter in this vicinity, always on guard, of course, and trapped the waterways between Yellowstone and the headwaters of the Missouri up near present-day Bozeman, Montana. Now let's pause here real quick for a disclaimer. Parts of this episode may get a little tedious. You're going to hear a lot of the trappers went to such and such place and trapped on such and such rivers, and then the rendezvous was held at such and such, punctuated by sporadic attacks by the Blackfeet. I thought about just summing it all up very quickly, but I decided to go ahead and give a full account of Bridger's time as a fur trapper. It may seem repetitive, but I think it highlights once again that these were working men out there primarily to do a job. You can't tell Bridger's story without telling the story of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Now with that in mind, let's head on to the rendezvous of 1827, held at Bear Lake in present-day Utah. The Shoshone came to join in on the festivities, but the Blackfeet decided to crash the party, attacking and killing a Shoshone man and his wife. In retaliation, Sublette led a joint force of trappers and snakes against the Blackfeet, killing 6 of them. And on it went. The next season would be just a repeat, with the Blackfeet and the trappers killing each other anytime the opportunity arose. And once more, the Blackfeet attacked the mountain men as they were beginning to assemble for the 1828 rendezvous, held again at Bear Lake. As goes the history of the Old West and much of the history of mankind, violence begets violence begets violence. Many a fur trapper held onto a simmering rage towards the Bugs Boys as they sought to avenge their fallen pals. Likewise, the Blackfeet took mountain men's scalps while exacting their own vengeance in honor of fallen sons and brothers and fathers. Subsequently, at least 10 trappers, probably more, would be slaughtered during the winter of 27 and 28. No idea how many Blackfeet would fall. Following that year's rendezvous, Bridger piloted a brigade into Crow Country, so a little change of pace, trapping along the Powder and Tongue rivers and wintering with the Crow on the Wind River where, ding ding ding, you guessed it, the 1829 rendezvous would be held. A place called Popo Aggie, just north of Lander, Wyoming. The first rendezvous, in fact, held east of the Continental Divide, and interestingly enough, the first of 2 rendezvous held that summer, with the second taking place a few weeks later at Pierre's Hole. Now, I'm not sure if Jim Bridger attended both of these gatherings. Matter of fact, I can't say for sure what he was up to that following trapping season either. He may or may not have piloted for Jed Smith that fall up to the Snake and Yellowstone rivers, before setting traps on the Musselshell and Judith. The 1830 rendezvous on the Wind River saw wagons being used to carry supplies to the trappers for the first time, as opposed to the usual string of pack mules. This would also be the first time any sort of wheeled vehicles at all had crossed the Continental Divide. This attests to the growing beaver market as more and more fur trappers were bringing in more and more pelts just to keep up with the demand. This rendezvous also saw Jim Bridger, now 26 years of age, finally become a partner in the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Jed Smith, Sublette, and Davy Jackson sold their interest in the company to Bridger, Tom Fitzpatrick, William Sublette's younger brother Milton, a German named Henry Fraub, often referred to as Frapp, and the French-Canadian Jean-Baptiste Gervais, aka Jervy. Jim was now a bourgeois, or boss, an 8-year veteran of the mountains with a proven track record. He knew the land, he knew the indigenous, he knew how to talk to them, when to talk and when to fight. He knew prime beaver, how to find it, and he knew how to lead men. Still couldn't read or write, though. He would never acquire those skills. But he more than made up for that shortcoming with guts, hard work, and a whole hell of a lot of mountain sense. This is also the same time that the American Fur Company, owned by John Jacob Astor, ventured into the Rockies. Inevitably, they and the Rocky Mountain Fur Boys came into direct competition. And as it was with the Hudson's Bay Company, things weren't always friendly between the opposing factions. In the fall of 1830, Bridger, Fitzpatrick, and Milt Sublette led a brigade of 80 men once again into Blackfeet country, trapping in the Three Forks region before wintering on the Yellowstone River. Come springtime, Jim would lead the men to the Tongue, where they had 57 horses stolen by the Crow. And of course, they tracked them on foot and got they damn horses back. From the Tongue, they rode to the Powder, and from there to the head of Laramie's Fork, trapping beaver the whole daggum way. The 1831 rendezvous was again on Bear River, as tons of company trappers, free trappers, and various Native American tribes showed up, looking to trade and celebrate. But this would not be the case. Tom Fitzpatrick, now that he was part owner of the company, was tasked with heading to St. Louis and securing supplies. He was to meet there with Jedediah Smith, finalize everything, and then return west in time for the summer gathering. Unfortunately, Fitzpatrick was about 2 months late getting to St. Louis, and having not heard from him, Jed Smith made an alternate plan to deliver these goods via wagon train to Taos and then Santa Fe. Ended up being a pretty big ordeal that saw the fur trappers in the Rockies left empty-handed. Mountain man Joseph Meek described the situation, saying that those attending the rendezvous had, quote, exhausted the stock of goods on hand. The camp was without blankets and without ammunition. Knives were not to be had, traps were scarce, but worse than all that, the tobacco had given out and alcohol was not. In such a case as this, what was a mountain man to do? End quote. After waiting around for a few more weeks with still no sign of Fitzpatrick, the trappers left for their fall hunt desperately undersupplied. Meanwhile, Fitzpatrick rushed to catch up with Smith. His new plan was to go ahead and continue on to Taos with Jedediah, and then rush north and start dispensing supplies to the boys. Sadly, though, it was on this trip that the great Jedediah Smith lost his life. In present-day Grant County, Kansas, not far from where the town of Ulysses now stands, Smith was scouting ahead of the wagon train when he ran into a Comanche war party. Family tradition states that Jed attempted to parley with the warriors to no avail. They opened up fire as he fought back, allegedly killing one of the chiefs, but it just wasn't no use. He was caught out in the open and was just plumb outnumbered. This was towards the end of May, and when the caravan reached Santa Fe over a month later, they found Jed's rifle, pistols, and other belongings already there, in the possession of some Comancheros who traded for them with the same warriors who did Jed in. By the way, I don't really discuss it much in this series, but a lot of people did refer to Jim Bridger as Old Gabe, and this was a nickname given to him by Jedediah Smith. I guess Jim reminded Jed of the angel Gabriel. Ultimately, Fitzpatrick and Bridger would not be reunited until that winter. Not only did Fitzpatrick come with the much-needed supplies that he doled out to the men right there in the field, but he also had a new recruit, a short, scrappy young man that had come with him out of New Mexico by the name of Kit Carson. That winter of 1831 and 32, Bridger and his men stayed with the Nez Perce and the Salish people before setting out to trap on Henry's Fork of the Snake. And they weren't alone. A brigade of men from Astor's American Fur were close on their back trail, looking to poach their beaver. I hate it when that happens. You know, in the same way that an angler doesn't want anybody knowing his special little fishing holes, Bridger was determined not to let these American Fur assholes know where the prime beaver country was. He even tried reasoning with them, offering to split up the mountains, but the American Fur bourgeois, a guy named Vanderberg, refused. We'll discuss this guy later, but he and his American Fur Brigade followed Bridger and his boys all the way to the 1832 rendezvous, whose location they weren't even supposed to know about. This irritation aside, the 1832 summer gathering was huge. This was peak beaver, and over 1,000 Native Americans and 400 fur trappers came together at Pierre's Hole. And that didn't sound right, did it? Everybody was having one hell of a good time until the damn Gros Ventre showed up and crashed the party. Or did they? Looks like what happens next is more the fault of the trappers than anything else. The Gros Ventre, cousins of the Arapaho and not to be mistaken by the Hidasta, people who were also known by the same name, were sometimes friends and sometimes enemies of the Blackfeet. And judging by the fact that they brought their women and kids to the rendezvous, I highly doubt they came to pick a fight. Sadly, they were mistaken as Blackfeet, and during a parley, some of the mountain men opened up fire, kicking off what's now referred to as the Battle of Pierre's Hole. Estimates vary, but there was somewhere between 150 and 300 Gros Ventre versus several hundred fur trappers and their Salish and Nez Perce allies. Due to some initial hesitation, the Gros Ventre were able to toss up a quick fort of sorts from fallen timber, and by the time the trappers and their friends were ready to attack, their quarry was pert well dug in. Nevertheless, the fight continued until a rumor spread among the trappers that maybe this was a ruse to open up the main rendezvous camp to attack from the Blackfeet. Which I don't know about you, but kind of sounds to me like they'd already been sipping at that whiskey. Fearing for their supplies and families, they rushed back to camp, allowing the Gros Ventre to slip away. When everything was said and done, somewhere around 26 Gros Ventre men, women, and children were dead, along with a dozen trappers. No word on Nez Perce or Salish casualties. By the way, the trappers would return later on, and using their knives, they'd dig all that valuable lead out of the bullet-ridden trees. As the summer came to an end, Bridger once again led a brigade of men toward Blackfeet country, and once again Vanderberg and them American Fur bastards followed. Gosh! Bridger tried a few tricks to shake them, leaving the campfires lit and seeing the men snuck away, or even splitting up and walking in streams to hide their tracks. But nothing worked. American fur was just dogging them every step of the way. Short of violence, Bridger was left with no other choice but to lead these interlopers on a wild goose chase, riding deeper and deeper into Blackfeet country while never even stopping to set a trap. Vanderburg, realizing that he needed to make some sort of profit or Mr. Astor would have his ass, finally stopped following Bridger and went to trapping on the Madison River, where he ended up getting killed by a Blackfeet war party. As for Bridger, Fitzpatrick, and the Rocky Mountain Fur, they set up on the Gallatin River, north or northwest of present-day Bozeman. And as usual, they had their own troubles with the Blackfeet, so much so that old Bridger himself was nearly done for. It all started when some fur trappers found a few Blackfeet in a lake and began firing their rifles all around them to prevent them from leaving the water. Ha ha, real funny. Only thing was, a shitload more Blackfeet soon arrived and now the tables were turned, causing these trappers to rush back to camp with some not-so-happy warriors on their tail. Now, these Blackfeet in question were led by a guy named Eagles Ribs, a member of the elite Buffalo Society who already boasted of 8 scalps he had personally taken off the head of unlucky fur trappers. And he made the first move, advancing on Bridger's camp with a small group of warriors, extending a pipe of peace. Jim rode out to meet him, accompanied by an equal number of his own men and a Blackfeet woman who was married to a Mexican free trapper named Loretto. Apparently, the unnamed lady had been taken by the Crow at some point before Loretto bought her, and now she traveled with Bridger's brigade as Loretto's wife. She was to act as an interpreter, and as luck would have it, her brother was a member of the opposing war party. As she, Jim, and the others approached Eagles Ribs, Bridger noticed movement coming from the Blackfeet, so he thumbed back the hammer of his rifle. Old Eagles Ribs heard the click and reached out, grabbing the rifle by the barrel. A struggle ensued, and for once, Bridger had met his match. 2 Blackfeet arrows slammed into his back, allowing Eagles Ribs to pull the rifle free and then smack Bridger upside the head with it. Jim would later claim that he was clubbed with such force that he initially thought his neck was broken. At this point, all hell breaks loose, with both sides opening up fire. Bridger's laying in the dirt, 2 arrows poking out of his back, and more than likely his own men thought he was done for. Hell, he probably thought he was done for. The Blackfeet seized Jim's horse and the woman, but she cried out and her husband Loretto came running, holding their little baby in his arms. At the sight of this, both sides ceased fire. The Blackfeet, admiring Loretto's courage, allowed him to hand the baby over to its mother and then return safely back to the trapper's camp. The warriors then departed, allowing the mountain men to rush in to Bridger's aid. Now, they were able to pull one of the arrows out of Jim's back without much trouble, but the other one was just too damn deep. They removed the shaft, but the arrowhead would remain lodged in Bridger's back, dangerously close to his spine. All total, 9 Blackfeet were said to have been killed during this skirmish, and 0 trappers, although Bridger was mighty lucky. His old pal Hugh Glass, however, had run slap out of luck. He would finally be caught out in the open by his foes, the Arikara, and they went ahead and finished off what that Mama Grizzly started all those years before. That was a bloody year out west. Sure, the Blackfeet and the Arikara were always at war with the Americans, or so it seemed, but even certain bands of the Shoshone and Crow had started taking fur trapper scalps. It weren't pretty. And what's more, things were about to get significantly worse for many of the tribes along the upper Missouri River. We'll get to that in just a moment, but one final note on old Eagles Ribs. That same year that he clubbed Bridger, either shortly before or after, he posed for the famed artist George Catlin at Fort Union. The painting that resulted is definitely worth checking out. Just Google Eagles Ribs, Blackfeet, and it's sure to pop up. He's wearing his fancy buffalo horn headdress, long fringed buckskin shirt, and he's holding a spear. And although I tried, I was unable to find out the man's ultimate fate. Jim and his brigade would not attend the rendezvous of 1833. They were just too far behind and needed to make money. So they stayed out trapping all summer and got resupplied in the field with a little mini one-day rendezvous. That winter, they would trap out of the Yampa River area, present-day northwest Colorado, and come spring, they'd head further south to Taos. Got to think maybe old Kit Carson has some influence on that decision. And oh, by the way, at this point, they were traveling with nobility. That's right, Sir Walter Drummond Stewart, a Scottish adventurer and the son of Sir George Stewart, the 17th Laird of Grand Tully. I don't know what the hell that means, but it sounds uppity. This Stewart guy appears to have had an obsession with the mountain men, and he came out west to observe them in the flesh. In doing so, he took a shine to Jim Bridger, not only gifting him a prized racehorse by the name of Athaloho, but in due time, even a full suit of knight's armor. Suffice to say, Walter Drummond Stewart was somewhat of a character, but from what I can tell, the mountain men did enjoy his company. Bridger and the men would trap near Taos before heading north again to the headwaters of the Laramie, and finally to the Green River and the rendezvous of 1834. Now, there would ultimately be like 5 or 6 rendezvous held at this same location, between where the towns of Pinedale and Daniel, Wyoming now stand. And if you've ever seen the TV show Meat Eater, there's an episode where the host Steven Ranella goes to this exact spot to trap beaver. It's on YouTube if you want to check it out, link in the show notes. I thought it was pretty damn cool. Not only is it informative, and not only does Ranella have the same genuine interest in the mountain men as we do, but you also get to see the landscape. You know, the place where these trappers called home for several weeks out of each summer, at least for a few summers. It's also where, in 1834, the future of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company would be decided. Former owner William Sublett and his partner Robert Campbell had been busy erecting a string of forts along the upper Missouri to compete with Astor's American Fur when it came to trade with the natives. In response, American Fur, backed by Astor's money, raised the price that they were paying for pelts to even more than they were worth in St. Louis, all in the attempt to force Rocky Mountain Fur out of business. A tactic that worked, as Sublett would sell his new forts to American Fur and ultimately give them control of all trading on the upper Missouri. I don't want to get too lost in the weeds here. A lot of stuff going on in the background. A lot of competition, backroom business deals, backstabbing, and extreme markup on supplies, even more extreme than usual. Long story short, William Sublett calls in Rocky Mountain Fur's debts, and the company went out of business, forcing Bridger, Fitzpatrick, and Milt Sublett to then form their own company. The beaver trade probably hit its peak between 1830 and 1832, but then as more and more trappers and traders flocked to the mountains, the beaver population began to dwindle, and by 1833, the price of fur began declining. The fun wasn't over yet, though. That following season, sometime in 1834, possibly at the rendezvous, Jim Bridger would tie the knot for the first time. His bride, real name unknown, but some sources claim she was called Cora, was the daughter of a Salish chief, allegedly. The Salish, by the way, were historically and erroneously referred to as the Flathead. Actually, if you want to be technical, they call themselves Scalo. And I know I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but it means the people. The language they speak is Salish, and since I do not think that they enjoy being called the Flathead, I'm pretty sure it's kind of a derogatory term nowadays. And I do try to make a habit to not be an asshole, and because I can't say the word Skilo, I will refer to them as Salish. And the present-day Flathead Reservation in Montana, by the way, is home to the Salish, Kootenai, and the Pend Oreille tribes. That said, there's not a lot of hard facts on Jim's first wife, and it appears that a lot of what we know is passed down from oral stories in the Bridger family. Cora was for sure of the Salish people, we just don't know that her daddy was really a chief. And she would accompany Jim on all of his trapping expeditions and end up bearing him 3 children. The winter of 1834 and 35, Bridger once more trapped in Blackfeet country, and he lost 5 of his men while doing so. Per Kit Carson, quote, "A trapper could hardly go a mile from camp without being fired upon." Even as Bridger and his men headed to their winter camp on the Snake River, the Blackfeet followed, stealing 18 horses, including Jim's prized Athaloho. A posse of sorts was formed, consisting of Kit Carson, Joe Meek, and about 10 others, and although they were successful in finding the offending Blackfeet, they were not able to retrieve Jim's horse. It weren't for a lack of trying, though. 3 Blackfeet lost their lives, and Carson himself got shot twice. The 1835 rendezvous found the men back at Green River, along with several hundred fur trappers of all shapes and sizes. American, French, Dutch, Mexican, even Portuguese. The Shoshone were in attendance, as were the Nez Perce, Ute, Bannocks, and Salish, even some Iroquois and Delaware. And this was the rendezvous where Carson got into that duel with the big dumb Frenchman Chouinard. Link in the show notes for that episode I did if you'd like to learn more. Kit versus Goliath. This is also when Jim finally got that damn arrowhead dug out of his back. A missionary was in attendance that year, Marcus Whitman, looking to bring salvation to the so-called savages. Just so happened that the good Reverend was also a doctor, or at least he was by the standards of 1835, which means that he underwent like 16 weeks worth of training. As dubious as that sounds, Whitman was able to extract the arrowhead. Bridger, after taking an ample amount of the anesthetic known as rock gut whiskey, lay flat on his belly as other trappers and natives looked on. Whitman produced a scalpel and a pair of pincers and went to work, noting that the arrowhead had hit a bone and partly worked behind a rib. Needless to say, several men had to hold Bridger down, but witnesses claimed that he made it through the ordeal with just a few groans and grunts. And just like that, he was free of his arrowhead. He would give it to the adventurer Sir Walter Stewart as a gift, and for years it was kept in a castle in Scotland. Come the end of summer, Bridger led the brigade, along with a large contingent of his wife's people, the Salish, to the Tetons, where Jim got to show off some of his own doctoring skills. Per usual, they were attacked by the Blackfeet, and one of Jim's men took a ball to the shoulder. Bridger made an incision in the man's back before using a wire to find and then pry the ball out. A cloth-covered pine stick was then ran through the wound to remove any poison that might have been on the ball. Crazy side note, but apparently, according to at least one source, the Blackfeet would catch rattlesnakes and release their venom into a piece of rancid meat. The warriors would then kind of score the lead balls just to rough them up and then roll them all over this infected meat. Whether this is true or whether or not this would even actually work, I don't know. Sounds kind of iffy to me. That said, lead intoxication can be caused by lead balls or other lead projectiles lodged in the human body. I don't doubt that the Blackfeet and other tribes attempted to poison their lead balls. I'm just not sure how effective such efforts were. The brigade then trapped their way across the divide to Stinking Springs before turning northwest to Beaverhead Creek to again camp with the Salish. This was around the time that Jim and Cora welcomed their first child, a little girl they'd call Mary Ann. That winter, they'd camp in present-day southeastern Idaho before heading south to trap the Bear River, traveling to the 1836 rendezvous in the company of several hundred lodges worth of Shoshone, Bannock, Salish, and Nez Perce. This is the same year that Fitzpatrick got his nickname, Broken Hand, after accidentally shooting himself in the hand while being chased by the Blackfeet. It's a wonder that dude made it out of the mountains alive, man. Just a few years prior, he had been caught alone by some Gros Ventre who forced him to retreat up a mountain. He fought him off until he had just like 1 or 2 balls left for his rifle, and then he hid in a crack in the rocks, just covered it all with brush. That night, the warriors hunting him actually camped nearly right on top of his hiding spot. He was able to slip away, but the entire ordeal was so nerve-wracking that it caused Fitzpatrick's hair to turn white overnight. That 1836 rendezvous also saw the return of the Reverend Marcus Whitman, this time with his wife Narcissa, as well as a few other missionaries, most notably Henry Spalding and his wife Eliza, all of them looking to tame the heathens. Now, it's worth noting that for Jim Bridger and many of these trappers, these were the first white women that they'd seen in a very long time. And for most of the Native Americans in attendance, it was their first time ever seeing white women. Needless to say, the fur trappers and indigenous warriors both made a big showing, all of them prancing their horses and even showing off their scalp collections as they tried to impress these eastern ladies. One has to wonder, though, how the native women felt, especially them married to American fur trappers. That's one point of view that we almost never hear from, the indigenous women, especially out west during this time period. And I think history suffers for it. As far as the missionaries go, I will say I'm not a fan at all. Not because I'm against religion, I just don't like the methods used by these so-called ministers in question. Reverend Spalding was especially cruel and sadistic after later forming a mission among the Nez Perce. It's just always struck me as a very strange way of spreading a gospel that's supposed to be centered around love and redemption. As for Dr. Reverend Marcus Whitman, we will discuss his fate soon enough. That season, Bridger and his men would air quotes discover the very cool parting of the waters at Two Ocean Pass. Now, during this trip, the boys were buggered by the Blackfeet, of course, and old Joe Meek got himself captured by the Crow. In turn, Jim Bridger captured a Crow warrior named Little Gun and exchanged him for Meek. Following this trade, the Crow and the trappers called a truce in order for both groups to better defend against the dreaded Blackfeet. And what happened next is kind of strange. It was mid-February and freezing when hundreds of Blackfeet approached the camp. The trappers scurried to build up a barricade of sorts as Jim handed out somewhere between 150 to 200 rifles to his 80 men so that they could all shoot more than once without having to reload. As these frantic preparations were underway, even more Blackfeet appeared. According to mountain man Osborne Russell, there were over 1,000. Kit Carson claimed 1,500, and Isaac Rose said it was between 1,500 to 1,600 warriors. Whatever the exact count, the trappers were outnumbered by more than 10 to 1, and they knew it. That night, as the temperature further plummeted, Jim and his fellow mountaineers could hear the Blackfeet working themselves up, singing their war songs. In turn, the Delaware and Salish among Bridger's camp painted themselves in preparations for what was to come. And that's when something weird happened. Around 10 p.m. that night, the sky was lit up by Aurora Borealis, northern lights, painting the firmament over the assembling Blackfeet the color of blood. The next morning, a lone Blackfeet warrior got close enough to the trappers to put a ball through one of Jim Bridger's cooks, but that was about all that happened. The Blackfeet did advance, at least 1,000 of them, but they stopped outside a rifle range and called out, said that there would be no fight that day. And with that, they turned and left. All these stories, grain of salt, right? I did check, and apparently the northern lights are sometimes visible, even in southwestern Montana. Was it this natural phenomenon that spooked the Blackfeet? Did they view it as sort of a bad omen? Or did they just not like the odds of going against dug-in fur trappers? The brigade trapped their way south and finally headed for the Green River to await another rendezvous and once more have trouble with the indigenous. Seems that a party of Bannocks camped a few miles away stole several horses from some French-Canadian trappers. The Voulez-Vous went and got their horses back and then drove them straight over to Bridger's camp for protection. Well, before you know it, here comes the Bannocks, pissed off. As the fight broke out, one of the Bannock warriors rushed in at Bridger and got close enough to grab his rifle before being shot to pieces. The trappers rallied and chased the Bannock onto a little island and pretty much killed all of them, at least all the men. The fight ended when a Bannock woman called out saying, quote, "You have killed all of our warriors. Do you now want to kill the women?" And with that, the trappers stopped firing. It was during that summer's rendezvous that we got a detailed description of Bridger. It read as follows. This was Mr. James Bridger, or Jim Bridger, who was engaged to fill the difficult and hazardous position he now held as a leader of beaver hunting parties, for which he was admirably adapted from his wide and thorough acquaintance with the whole mountain regions, from the Russian settlements to the Californias, and every hidden nook and hidden lake and unfrequented stream. His bravery is unquestionable, his horsemanship equally so, and as to his skill with a rifle, it will scarcely be doubted when we mention the fact that he has been known to kill 20 buffalo by the same number of consecutive shots. The physical conformation of this man was in admirable keeping with his character. Tall, 6 feet at least, muscular, without an ounce of superfluous flesh to impede its force or exhaust its elasticity. He might have served as a model for a sculptor or painter by which to express the perfection of graceful strength and easy activity. His cheekbones were high, his nose hooked, the expression of his eye mild and thoughtful, and that of his face grave, almost to solemnity. One remarkable feature of this man I had almost omitted was his neck, which rivaled the head in size and thickness, and which gave the upper portion of his otherwise well-formed person a somewhat unpleasant appearance. To complete the picture, he was perfectly ignorant of all knowledge in books, not even knowing the letters of the alphabet, but put perfect faith in dreams and omens, and was unutterably scandalized if even the most childish of the superstitions of the Indians were treated with anything like contempt or disrespect, for in all of these he was a firm and devout believer. End quote, and holy shit, did these people love their run-on sentences. So yeah, about that neck. Bridger had goiter, which is an irregular growth on the thyroid gland. There are many causes for goiter, one of which is just being a female. Seriously, per the Mayo Clinic, women are more likely to develop goiter. Also, pregnancy and menopause can cause it as well. None of these apply to Bridger, of course, but the number one cause of goiter throughout the world is a lack of iodine, or salt. And if I had to guess, this was probably the case with Jim. Kinda ironic considering his relationship with the Great Salt Lake. Now, I'm only aware of 2 photos of Jim Bridger, both taken when he was a much older man. And I personally can't tell there's any deformity or growth on his neck. This description of Bridger is not the only one that mentions the goiter. Hell, his name among various tribes once was the Blanket Chief. As soon as the goiter kicked in, they started calling him Big Throat. I'm not making that up, seriously. So he definitely had it. Maybe the condition was rectified by the time Bridger sat down for the camera. I don't know. From what I read, it is possible for goiter to go away on its own. But then again, I'm not a reverend doctor like Marcus Whitman. This was also the rendezvous where Sir Walter gifted Bridger that suit of knight's armor. Very curious as to what happened to this armor. I couldn't find the source, but I remember reading years ago that Bridger cached it away somewhere in the mountains. Or at least I think I remember reading that. Could be in a fiction novel, I honestly don't know. It's just something that's been logged in my brain. If he did cache it away, what a great find that would be. So if you see anything on the news about a hiker or hunter finding a knight's helmet or a chest plate up in the damn Rockies somewhere, you know who left it there. That next winter, Bridger and his brigade would camp out on the Powder River next to a Crow village for one of the coldest winters that any of them could remember. They actually had to corral their horses and feed them bark cut from the cottonwood branches. This is around the same time that they heard tell of the smallpox outbreak among the tribes. Turns out a steamboat, they had those now, went up the Missouri with an infected passenger. This patient zero unwittingly infected the Arikara, and then the Mandan, and from there it spread west like wildfire. This was huge, really a defining moment, as over 17,000 Native Americans succumbed to the outbreak. Some estimates double that number, by the way. It wiped out like over 90% of the Mandan population, around 50% of the Arikara, and once it hit the Blackfeet, would kill 2/3 of their population. Never again would the Blackfeet be the formidable force they once were. Not to say that there was no more sporadic violence between them and the trappers. Matter of fact, Bridger and his men would have at least one more fight, if you want to call it that, with this once mighty tribe. The brigade came upon a trail of a Blackfeet camp that they estimated to be about 3 or 4 days ahead of them. The following day, they found a lodge with several dead, pox-marked bodies inside. Looking to avoid trouble, Jim changed course, but in doing so, he damn near had a mutiny on his hands. Relenting, the brigade continued to follow and soon located the village. The fur trappers began preparing to attack, but Bridger refused to allow the men under his command to take part. Of course, he had no authority over the free trappers, and about 15 or so of them went on ahead, creeping in close and opening fire on the surprised inhabitants. According to Kit Carson, who was one of the attackers, quote, "We were determined to try our strength to discover who had the best right to the country. We soon reached the village, attacked it, and killed 10 Indians, taking several scalps." Now, the Blackfeet would rally and chase the free trappers back to camp, where more shots were exchanged until finally all of the mountain men charged and, as one trapper put it, went barrel to barrel. The Blackfeet broke off the attack and carried away what dead they could to mourn. A lot of mourning going on at this time. The situation was damn near repeated not long after when these same trappers came upon yet another Blackfeet village, a smaller one consisting of just around 15 lodges. The mountain men approached, but were quickly taken back at the sight of several Blackfeet emerging from their teepees, unarmed, skeletal thin, and ravaged by disease. Their chief, Little Robe, flat out told Bridger that they were all dying, and finally the fur trappers extended some mercy. Instead of slaughtering these sick people, they finally called a peace. The next rendezvous of 1838 was on the Popo Aggie, with even more missionaries showing up. Also in attendance was a man named Johann Sutter, who would one day find his way to California and build Sutter's Fort. A decade later, one of his workers would make a discovery that would absolutely change the course of U.S. history, but that's another story for another series. Now at this point, the beaver fur trade is in serious decline, due to both a lack of demand and an economic depression. There was even talk of no more rendezvous. Guess it was no longer financially viable to bring the supply wagons back and forth. Consequently, many a seasoned mountain man was calling it quits, Kit Carson included. Not Jim Bridger, though, not yet. That fall, he led another brigade of men to the Wind River through the Tetons and over to Pierre's Hole before dipping south for the 1839 rendezvous on the Green River. And it was there he discovered that the fur companies would not be hiring out any trapping brigades that fall. Beaver had done petered out due to a myriad of reasons I've already listed, and it was no longer worth it to spend your winters wading into freezing water in dangerous country. And just like that, the now 35-year-old Jim Bridger was out of a job. Bridger was tall, fully 6 feet high, erect, thin, wiry, and sunburnt almost to the complexion of an Indian. With a face noble and expressive of generosity, dark brown hair, and liquid hazel eyes, bright almost to blackness. In form, he was straight as an arrow, wore moccasins, and, as an Indian, turned his toes as he walked slightly inward. So strikingly did his manners conform to those of the wild denizens of the forest. This was the description given of Jim Bridger in the fall of 1839 as he returned to the settlements for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Following the rendezvous, he accompanied Andrew Drips back to St. Louis with the last haul of beaver plues, later claiming that this was the first time he tasted bread in 17 years. Gotta wonder how Bridger felt, leaving the clean air of the mountains and suddenly finding himself immersed in the hustle and bustle of the city. Story goes that he crossed the river and went back to his childhood home, just to look around, I reckon, to reminisce. His parents were long dead, and so was his brother. His sister may or may not have still been alive. So far as I know, historians have not yet uncovered her name, so we're not sure of her fate. If she was alive at this time, it's likely that Jim paid her a visit. Same goes for his old gunsmith boss, Philip Creamer. Sentiments aside, city life weren't for Jim. He got sick as a dog, all burnt up with a fever, and let it be known that he was ready to, quote, go back to his free life in the mountains. His former career as a fur trapper was no longer an option, however, at least not if he wanted to make money. And his once pristine mountains were quickly filling up with migrants and preachers, the damn lawyers and bankers sure to follow. Bridger would have to learn to adapt, and adapt he would. Only problem was there were some Western newcomers hell-bent on taking everything that he would build, even if it meant going to war and even if it meant calling down the Lord's wrath. While still in St. Louis, Bridger met up with his old friend, the German trapper Henry Frab, and the two partnered up, combining their money and leading a group of men west to trap yet another season, just giving it one last shot. They had run-ins with the Lakota on the way west, crossing the plains, on 3 separate occasions as the natives tried to extort the trappers for payment. And each time it was Jim Bridger who rode out to meet them and pacify them. And by pacify, I mean he calmed everybody down and avoided violence. And I think this is what stuck out the most to me when researching Bridger. While he was certainly capable of violence, he wasn't a violent man. He had killed when he had to, but he also knew how to diffuse and de-escalate. He never went out of his way to pick a fight, nor did he seem to hold grudges, at least not against the American Indians. He knew them perhaps better than any other non-native who ever lived and was deeply familiar with their beliefs and customs and practices. And more often than not, he was able to talk his way out of trouble if given the opportunity. Bridger and Frab attended the 1840 rendezvous on the Green River, the last official rendezvous, where Jim was reunited with his wife Cora and daughter Mary Ann. Now this didn't verify, but it's likely Jim went with Frab and Joseph Walker to California that fall. If he did, they would have reached Los Angeles by February of 1841 and stay there until mid-April. Once back in the mountains, Bridger and Frab constructed Fort Bridger, the first Fort Bridger, that is. There would ultimately be 3 of them. And the idea behind this fort was to be a place for Bridger to trade out of with the various friendly tribes, as well as serving as a base of operations of sorts to keep a roof over the head of his wife and child while he was away. Now this fort was on the Green River in present-day Wyoming, a few miles south of Big Sandy where, just looking at a map, it would appear the Sietskadee National Wildlife Refuge now is. Can't wait for the emails telling me how badly I just butchered the word Sietskadee. Sietskadee. If you shake your Sietskadee 3 times, you're playing with it. Alright. That summer, Frab would be killed during a fight with a combined force of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, not far from present-day Savory, Wyoming. He went down fighting, and according to fellow trapper Jim Baker, the German, quote, was the ugliest-looking dead man I ever saw, all covered with blood, rotten front teeth, and a horrible grin, end quote. Also that summer, Jim sent his daughter Mary Ann to the Whitman Mission in Oregon, started by the missionaries I mentioned last episode, Marcus Whitman and his wife Narcissa. A few months later, Jim and Cora welcomed another child, a boy that they named Felix Francis Bridger. All was good at home, but things were turning more and more violent on the plains as the various tribes got themselves all worked up for a number of reasons. I mean, hell, dealer's choice at this point, right? Wagon trains were now passing through, headed to Oregon. The various diseases wreaking havoc. One thing to keep in mind when thinking about the so-called Indian Wars is how quickly things were changing for these people. Whereas some tribes didn't mind the fur trappers passing through on occasion, they weren't happy with the wagon trains of immigrants and gold seekers now flooding their hunting grounds. And they sure as hell didn't like seeing their loved ones dying slow deaths as their bodies were ravaged by disease. Just something to contemplate. Following old Frap's death, Bridger would team up with another longtime friend, Louis Vasquez. He also abandoned his first fort and erected a new one, about 40 miles or so south of Black's Fork on the Green River. If you're looking at a modern map, this is in southwestern Wyoming, just north of present-day Mountain View. And finally, the third, Fort Bridger, was raised in 1843, pretty much in the same area. My understanding is that they moved it from a beach overlooking Black's Fork down to the grassy bottomland below. Now, this was Shoshone territory, but technically also Mexico, in addition to being along an ancient native trading route that would later be adopted by wagon trains headed west. That being the case, this fort would allow Bridger to sell his wares and services to the pilgrims headed to the Promised Land. 2 double log cabins were built, as was a blacksmith shop, a trading room, and a stockade for the livestock. And as previously stated, this also gave Jim a little peace of mind knowing that Cora and young Felix were relatively safe within the fort's log walls when he was out roaming. Then again, this was the American frontier in the 1840s, and you could only keep your family so safe. Case in point, that very year a large war party of Cheyenne led by a damn renegade named Louis Revere struck the fort. They killed a native woman and her child in addition to a Salish man guarding the horses, and made off with 70 head before Jim could so much as level his rifle. They also hit the nearby Shoshone, killing a few of them and making off with an additional 100 horses. At the same time, Jim was also having financial problems. He was in debt and hadn't made any real money since 1838. As such, he was finding it hard to secure credit for the supplies that he would need to trade with the passing wagon trains. Yet despite not making a profit, he still trapped beaver, his old bread and butter. And yes, it was still dangerous. He led 13 men to work the waterways of the Salt Lake Valley in the spring of 1844 and lost 2 killed to the hostiles. Luckily, more immigrants than ever traveled west that year, and the hard-working Bridger was able to make a little money, at least. His blacksmith shop did brisk business, and he and Vasquez kept plenty of horses to trade to the travelers. Usually the deal was that he'd swap out one of his well-fed mounts for 2 skinny pilgrim nags. He and Vasquez also took to keeping various livestock on hand, up to and including oxen, cattle, goats, and sheep. Late that summer, Bridger would lead some men south to present-day Arizona to trap, a land they called Coyoterra, and even further south to the Gulf of California. Not stopping to winter, they traveled north from there up to present-day Utah, passing through the desert as they did so. In late 1845 or early 1846, another daughter was born to Jim and Cora, Mary Josephine, and sadly Cora would die not long after. A very tragic death, by the way. The story passed down to the family was that Cora was bitten by a wolf and inflicted with rabies. She went mad and disappeared into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Got to imagine there's much more to the story than that, but unfortunately that's all we got to work with. The constant trauma these people dealt with on just a day-to-day basis, man. I think it would break most of us nowadays. Now, this is also around the time that a man by the name of Lansford Hastings paid Fort Bridger a visit. And oh boy, here we go. The Oregon Trail came out of Independence, Missouri, right? It led west through modern-day Nebraska and Wyoming and passed north of Bridger's Fort before swinging northwest through what's now southern Idaho, where Fort Hall was located, and then on into Oregon and the Promised Land. And then you had the California Trail, which branched off from the Oregon at Fort Hall, Idaho, and snaked southwest along the Humboldt River through what we now call Nevada and then on to the Golden State. Well, this Lansford Hastings guy had what he called a shortcut. It wasn't. In all actuality, it added 20 miles, but whatever. And this shortcut went straight due west from Fort Bridger, linking up with the California Trail not far from where Elko, Nevada now stands, thus bypassing the need to go north to Fort Hall. Cool. Only problem was this route, also known as the Hastings Cutoff, meant that you had to pass over the Wasatch Mountains and travel a good 80 waterless miles through the Great Salt Desert. It's a journey that had previously been taken, and although arduous, it was possible. That said, those of you over the age of 40 might remember the old Oregon Trail computer game, and how you had to carefully choose what time of the year to embark on your journey. If you started too early, there wouldn't be enough water or game. Or maybe there'd be too much water with the river swollen from snow melt. Start too late and you'll get caught up by the snow and also have a hard time finding game. I mean, shit, you know half your party's gonna get dysentery and cholera anyway, why add to it? Likewise in real life with the Hastings and California trails. You had to time your travels just right or you'd get stuck up there in the mountains and freeze to death. Enter in the Reed and Donner parties out of Illinois. They, along with their employees, arrived at Fort Bridger on July 27, 1846, with plans to take the Hastings Cutoff. And our very own Jim Bridger advised the travelers as to the condition of the trail that lay ahead. Mr. Bridger informs me that the route we designed to take is a fine level road, plenty of water and grass with the exception of the desert, wrote James Reed in a letter home, shortly before his doomed party set out to their fate. Furthermore, a member of their wagon train, Edwin Bryant, had previously ridden on ahead and noticed how rough the cutoff truly was and left a note at Fort Bridger telling the Donners and Reeds not to take the trail. He thought it would be too hard for wagons, especially with so many women and children. Well, the Donner party did not receive this note of warning, and after conferring with Bridger, they went on ahead. And we all know how that turned out. So why wasn't Bridger more honest about the dangers that lie ahead? And why did he not deliver the note of warning telling the travelers to take another route? Jim knew every inch of every possible trail that these pilgrims could have taken, and he knew damn well the conditions of Hastings Cutoff. You would think that he'd talk them into going up north to Fort Hall and thus making it through to California before the snow begins to fly. Or at very least just to be honest about what lay ahead. So what the hell happened? Well, there are some that think that this was greed. The idea being that if more people used the Hastings Cutoff, it would mean more business for Fort Bridger, and thus more money in Jim's pocket. Historian and author Jerry Insler disagrees. Mr. Insler contends that Bridger's description of the road was accurate. A cartographer named T.H. Jefferson was in a party ahead of the Donners and, as he was mapping out the route, described the desert portion as, quote, road good, a level plain, followed by, quote, the journey is attended with some hardships and provocation. Nothing, however, but that can be overcome. The most difficult portion of the whole journey is the passage of the California mountains, particularly the descent on the western side, end quote. Insler also states that Bridger was well known to give extensive commentary whenever asked about various routes or trails, and entire maps, accurate maps, had been created based solely on Jim's words. The idea that all he said about the cutoff was that it was a fine level road doesn't jive with his normal mode of communication. It's more likely that Bridger expanded on the trail a good deal, but Reed simply didn't jot down Jim's every word in that letter. Furthermore, the idea that he would have withheld pertinent information to these travelers for his own personal gain would have been out of character. And I got to admit, I tend to agree. I mean, it'd be one thing if Bridger had a past habit of being less than honest, or even a willingness to put innocent people's lives at risk just to make a buck, but I have not seen that to be the case. As for the warning letter, I have no idea. Years later, James Reed would blame Louis Vasquez, Bridger's partner, for concealing the note in order to secure more business for the fort, but it does not appear that he ever cast any suspicion towards Jim himself. Per Jerry Insler, once again, speaking of the Donner Party, quote, they set out too late, they took too many breaks, they had plenty of money but did not hire an experienced guide to keep them moving. They banished James Reed, and they stayed and rested for 5 days before trying to cross the final summit, end quote. He then cites Sam Brannan as saying the party consisted of people who, by quarreling and fighting among themselves, delayed time until they got caught in the mountains and could not extricate themselves. Finally, you have Reed himself who admitted, quote, the disasters of the company to which I belonged should not deter any person from coming who wishes to try his fortune. Our misfortunes were the result of bad management. Had I remained with the company, I would have had the whole of them over the mountains before the snow would have caught them, and those who have gotten through have admitted this to be true, end quote. Look, I got no dog in this fight. I guess it's possible that Jim could have misled these people for his own monetary gain, but once again, this does seem to be in direct contradiction to how he normally conducted himself. Which brings us to the next leg of the journey. In 1847, Jim was bound for Fort Laramie when he saw a large party approaching not far from Little Sandy. This group, as it turns out, was 143 members of the Church of Latter-day Saints led by Brigham Young. And in a tradition that we all hold to this very day, Bridger would soon regret not turning around and immediately running at the sight of approaching Mormon missionaries. Oh, I'm kidding, Mormons. Don't get your magical underwear all up in a bunch. You know y'all used to be assholes, right? On a serious note, I love Mormons. I'm not being sarcastic. They are some of the finest people I've ever met, and I don't think I've ever had a single negative interaction with them. They make great neighbors, great friends, and I've found them all, at least the ones I've known, to be genuinely nice people. Their church, however, does have a screwed up history. So trigger warning, if you are a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, I'm probably going to talk a little smack about your predecessors coming up, especially Brigham Young. Now, this group that Bridger met was just an advance party, searching for a place to put down roots free of religious persecution. A home where they could live as they saw fit, and I don't blame them. Jim ended up pitching camp early and invited Young and some elders over to talk. He advised them at length on the Great Basin area and corrected their maps, showing that the Great Salt Lake and Utah Lake were indeed two separate bodies of water. He described the natives that called the area home, and he advised the pilgrims to ascertain whether or not they can grow wheat or corn before putting down roots. When they went their separate ways the next morning, Young asked if Bridger would guide him, but Jim had business to attend at Fort Laramie and he would not return in time to do so. So all in all, a good first impression, right? As time went on, even more Mormons would come, most of them stopping at Fort Bridger along the way. And the rest is history. As we all know, the area around Great Salt Lake is now Mormon Central. Just a bunch of saints minding their own business, soaking and jump humping. Only problem was, for some damn reason, Brigham Young just flat out did not like Jim Bridger. As quickly as just a year after their meeting, Young was spreading lies and claiming that Jim had set the quote-unquote Indians upon he and his flock. Bridger found out about this, saddled up a mule, and personally rode down to Salt Lake City telling Brigham Young to say it to his face. And no, that part's not true. But Jim did send Brigham a letter that he had dictated, which read as follows. I am truly sorry that you should believe any reports about me having said that I would bring any Indians or any number of Indians upon you or any of your community. Such a thought never entered my head, and I trust to your knowledge and good sense to know that if a person is desirous of living a good friendship with his neighbors, he would not undertake such a mad project. I am desirous of maintaining an amicable friendship with the people in the valley. And should you want a favor in my hand at any time, I shall always think myself happy in doing it for you. From your friend and well-wisher, James Bridger. P.S. Is it true you really have magic underwear? Because my long johns are really starting to chafe and I could use a change. P.P.S. Are you as excited about the next season of Sister Wives as I am? OMG, I can't wait to see what Cody and Robin do next. Just kidding on the P.S. and P.P.S. The rest of that letter was real, though. And once again, there you have Jim Bridger, the diplomat, trying to defuse the situation. So where did Brigham Young get these wild ideas? And what was it that caused him to turn on Bridger? So Brigham Young and his flock were indeed having problems with the natives, namely the Ute. And some Ute had already been killed by the Mormons, which sure as hell wasn't helping matters. Furthermore, the Ute were well armed. I think maybe Young figured that it was Bridger who provided the Ute with said firearms, and maybe he did. Hell, Jim had been trading arms with the indigenous for quite some time. But did he ever arm anyone knowing that they were then going to use the guns to kill Americans? Highly doubtful. Bridger's partner Vasquez had also been in contact with the church leaders, helping to advise them. He wrote a note of his own saying that he knew that they had killed some Ute and that Jim had gone to winter with the tribe, but once he saw how worked up they were, he returned to Fort Bridger. I guess the paranoid Young didn't appreciate these fur traders knowing so much about he and his people's business, and for whatever reason he got it into his head that it was Jim who stirred up the natives, something for which there is absolutely no evidence for. To further highlight Young's insanity, in 1849 Vasquez wrote Brigham and warned him that the Bannocks were upset and planning to raid the Salt Lake area. Brigham read this letter out loud in a council and then weirdly proclaimed, quote, I believe I know old Bridger is death on us, and if he knew 400,000 Indians were coming against us, and any man were to let us know, he would cut his throat. Bridger is a backhanded man that can't be understood. Gotta love extreme paranoia coupled with fundamentalist cult-like views. A winning combination that always ends well, right? From there on, things only continued to worsen. In 1850, on the same day that California was admitted to the Union, Utah became a territory, largely in part to all the Mormons who had been settling there over the previous couple of years. Matter of fact, they already had their own state constitution and sort of a de facto government before even becoming a territory. The state of Deseret, I believe they called it. Brigham Young became the first governor of this territory, of course, and began enacting laws already laid out in their own little Mormon constitution. This is when they really started coming at Bridger hard. First, they had given him a quote-unquote tavern license, which allowed him to sell liquor there at his fort, as if Bridger needed such permission. They then revoked the license in 1853 before issuing an arrest warrant for Jim with further claims that he was inciting the Ute and providing them with arms and ammunition to use against Americans. In short, Jim Bridger was being charged with treason, which back in them days was a hanging offense. But what it really boils down to is, according to historian Fred Goins, Brigham Young's growing desire to control the Fort Bridger Green River area, and that the Mormons were not content to see this lucrative business go to the enrichment of the mountain men. By the way, it wasn't just the fort. Jim had a ferry set up on the Green River as well that was earning money and manned by some of his former fur trapping buddies. The Mormons wanted the ferry and the fort and the money that both were generating, more than they wanted Bridger himself. He was just an excuse. Finally, Young sent his army of Mormons up there, and while Jim was gone, they attacked the fort, killing a few fur trappers working on the Green River ferry and destroying all of Bridger's whiskey supply in, quote, small doses. I'll let you figure that one out for yourself. Worth noting that not everybody took this lying down. A month prior, the Mormons had attempted to seize the ferry on Green River, but 50 former mountain men raised their rifles, so the Saints went back to Salt Lake City with their tails tucked between their legs, only to return with a much larger force. Word got to Bridger that his fort had been seized and that he was a wanted man, so, while he did return to the area, he laid low and camped out in the hills. The clever man he was still able to somehow communicate with his wife, who just so happened to still be in the fort. By the way, good luck to any Mormons attempting to flush Bridger out of those hills. If he didn't want to be found, it was not going to happen. We're talking about a man who piloted fur brigades and trapped beaver and dined on elk all over the entirety of Blackfeet territory for years without losing his hair. Now, I should admit that I sometimes get frustrated with history, selfishly, when it comes to these types of situations. I would love to envision a scenario where Bridger puts the word out, calling in some of his buddies. Maybe Kit Carson and Jim Beckwourth and Joe Meek and, a few hundred Crow and Shoshone. And they all ride on down to Salt Lake City and pin Brigham Young's ears to the tabernacle. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, this ain't the movies and real life isn't always exciting or just. And remember, although he could be violent, Bridger wasn't a violent man at heart. Ever the diplomat, right? Instead of calling down the thunder, Jim traveled all the way to Washington, D.C. to complain to his representatives in person. Old Broken Hand Fitzpatrick, now an Indian agent, was traveling to the capital to help finalize the Treaty of Fort Atkinson, and Bridger accompanied him. Sadly, Fitzpatrick would succumb to pneumonia while there, dying with Jim by his side. And although Bridger was able to speak with the government about his problems with the Mormons, all this did was end up pissing off Brigham Young even further. In the end, it was all for naught. The Mormons took Fort Bridger, and short of going to war, Jim had to write it off as a loss. The church would eventually give him some money for his troubles, but not anything near what the fort or the land it was on was worth. And the government did get involved, but all they did was take the fort over for themselves. They claimed to be leasing it from Bridger, but when it came time for payments, they balked, saying that Jim couldn't provide sufficient proof that he was the owner of the fort bearing his name. Okay. This would be a long legal battle, and it would take years following Jim's death for his family to ever receive any sort of compensation. Now, during this entire affair, Bridger just wasn't sitting around twiddling his thumbs. The events I've just described took place over several years. Jim encountered Brigham Young and the first Mormon pilgrims in the summer of 1847, and it would be in the spring or summer of 49 when Young declared that Bridger was, quote, death on us. It would be another 4 years after that, in 1853, when the church labeled Jim a traitor. And that following summer, in August, when Bridger was away on business, was when they seized the fort. So this was a process, and Bridger was a busy man at the time, both in his personal and professional life. If you'll recall, Jim's first wife, Cora, passed away in either 1845 or 46, after giving birth to Josephine. That made 3 kids for Bridger, the first daughter Mary Ann, who was sent to live at the Whitman Mission near present-day Walla Walla, Washington, the boy Felix, and finally little Josephine. Somewhere around 1847 or 1848, Bridger would marry for a second time to a Ute lady that some sources say was named Chipeta, not to be confused with the Chipeta that was married to the famous Ute chief Ouray. Don't know anything else about Jim's Chipeta. She was likely still a teenager when she and Bridger married, and they'd only have one child, a girl named Virginia, but unfortunately Chipeta would pass away a few days later from complications. Shortly thereafter, once again, we don't have any dates here, they sure as hell weren't married to no church, Bridger got hitched to his third wife, a Shoshone girl that he called Mary, and it weren't long before she and Jim welcomed a baby boy into the world, naming him John. A lot of Marys in Jim's life. So far he's got a daughter named Mary Josephine, another daughter named Mary Elizabeth, and yet another named Mary Ann, and now a wife also named Mary. By the way, many sources list this Mary as being the daughter of Shoshone Chief Washakie, but I was unable to verify that. I was also unable to link Jim's marriage to any of these indigenous women to First Lieutenant Aldo Apache Rain, despite his inglorious claims. If you get it, you get it. All total, Bridger would have 7 children that we know of, and we will discuss them more, but for now I think it's important to talk about his firstborn, Mary Ann. She was 12 years old in 1847 and had been living with Marcus and Narcissa Whitman for the past 6 years. I guess technically they were her guardians, but for all intents and purposes, they had basically adopted her. She was referred to by Narcissa as her little girl, sometimes affectionately called her little half-breed, and if the Reverend Marcus was gone, Mary Ann would often ask, "Will Father come home today?" It appears that Mary Ann had a good life there, as far as the historical evidence shows. Narcissa made her dresses by hand, as well as dolls. She was receiving an education and had 2 nurturing adults that cared for her. As far as I know, Bridger had never gone up there to visit. Not even sure if Mary Ann knew of her mother's death a year prior, but that's purely speculation on my part. Judging by Jim's relationships to his other children, he did seem to be an affectionate father. So this entire situation is a little hard to track. I know the idea was for Mary Ann to receive an education, but 6 years is a long time to go without seeing your kid. I got a little daughter, and I can't imagine that. That said, I do find it hard to believe that Jim and Cora simply abandoned their daughter. And there was absolutely no way they could have predicted the tragedy that was about to occur. Now, the Whitman mission was in Cayuse country, there in southeastern Washington. I will defer once again to my friends at the podcast How the West Was Fucked. Check out their 2-part series on the Whitman Massacre. But don't check out their series on Jim Bridger. Link in the show notes. But long story short, there was trouble, tensions were on the rise, and then the plague struck the Cayuse in the form of a measles epidemic. One source I found stated that half the tribe died, and a good deal of them were children. There's a lot more involved. Like I said, check out that series if you want the full story. But the Cayuse would, in their anger, attack the Whitman mission. They killed both Marcus and Narcissa, along with 11 others, and took over 50 captives, one of which was Bridger's daughter, Mary Ann. Fur trapper Joe Meek also had a daughter there as well, Helen, and she likewise was taken captive. And unfortunately, she and another child would die in captivity due to an illness. Mary Ann Bridger survived, though. Some sources say she may have been used, but she was ransomed back a month following the massacre. During the process of getting her back to civilization, she also became ill and soon passed away. Ironically, it was one of Bridger's former rivals, Peter Ogden, and the Hudson's Bay Company, who secured the release for these hostages. Bridger wouldn't even find out until visited by Joe Meek, who was on his way to Washington to demand justice. Interestingly enough, Meek's cousin Sarah was the then First Lady of the United States and wife of President James K. Polk. Guess maybe Meek thought he could pull some strings. Once again, this is not one of those Hollywood endings. Tragedy struck first to the Cayuse people at large, and then to the Bridger and Meek households. A war with the Cayuse ensued, leading to many a death, and in 1850, 5 Cayuse men were publicly hanged for their part in the massacre. There were no happy endings or peaceful resolutions for any involved, just grieving parents and orphaned children. But so goes history. Despite losing a daughter and despite Brigham Young breathing down his neck, Jim Bridger still had to earn a living. Enter in Uncle Sam, or at least the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers. Captain Howard Stansbury and his 16-man expedition of cartographers, illustrators, scientists, and soldiers were tasked with surveying the Great Salt Lake, evaluating the Mormon and Oregon trails, and hopefully finding a likely route for a transcontinental railroad. A daunting task that would need a capable guide. And who more qualified than Jim Bridger? After all, he had been roaming these quote-unquote unexplored areas for over the past 25 years. All in all, it was a very frustrating experience for Bridger, babysitting these wet-behind-the-ears pilgrims in such a fashion. Not only was he mad at himself for taking the job, but he swore that he would never guide for the Army again. An oath that wouldn't last very long, as Jim would once more accompany Stansbury in the fall of 1850. This time to another possible railroad crossing over the Continental Divide, now known as Bridger's Pass, about 20 miles southwest of Rawlins, Wyoming. This was a trip full of memories for Bridger. One evening, they camped just 2 miles from the spot his longtime friend Henry Frabb fell to the Lakota. And the following day, they came to where Jim's current business partner, Vasquez, along with 14 other traders, were once in an hours-long battle with the same tribe. Needless to say, Jim ordered the men to keep their rifles handy. And sure enough, as they pressed east, not far from Cheyenne Pass, Bridger spotted the natives tracking them. And what I'm about to recount, in my opinion, shows how effective Bridger was at keeping his scalp all those years. He could size up a situation, and he knew when to run, when to make a stand, when to fight, and when to talk. This was a time for talking. Bridger the diplomat. Noticing that the warriors were keeping their distance, Jim shouldered his rifle and approached, alone and on foot, signing for the Lakota to come out and talk as he neared. They did, and as it turned out, they were Oglala and Cheyenne. Bridger invited them to camp, and here they came a-galloping, shaking hands all around and looking to trade. After doing a little business, Jim then began entertaining his guests. Using a mixture of what Lakota and Cheyenne he knew, coupled with sign, Jim took to telling his legendary stories, and in no time flat, these hardened warriors of the prairie were doubled over in laughter. Given a different scout, or even a different approach, who knows? Things could have turned out much differently. The expedition soon reached Fort Laramie, and Bridger's job was done, at least for this go-around, and the trail they had just blazed, one known by the mountaineers for decades and the indigenous for centuries, would now be dubbed the Overland Trail. About a year later, Jim would return to Fort Laramie to attend the Horse Creek Treaty, the largest assembly of Native Americans up to that point, if I'm not mistaken, in all of recorded history. Among the tribes in attendance were the Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, Hadassah, Mandan, Arikara, Arapaho, and the Shoshone, which is why Bridger was there. He was looking out for the interest of his in-laws, the Shoshone, and escorting Chief Washakie himself. In the summer of 1852, Bridger would send Felix and Mary Josephine to St. Louis in order for them to be enrolled in Catholic school. Guess he reckoned on this being a much safer way for his children to receive an education. And this is also about the time that the problem with the Mormons all came to a head, so I'm sure he was looking to keep them clear of potential harm. Bridger would eventually move his entire family to Westport, Missouri, where Kansas City now stands. And in the winter of 1853, he sent Virginia to join her siblings at school in St. Louis as he traveled to D.C. with Broken Hand Fitzpatrick. And we already discussed how that ended. With Fort Bridger out of the picture, Jim and Vasquez planned a new trading post along the Santa Fe Trail, and they both bought land outside of Westport. Financially, they did all right. Hell, Jim even bought a mercantile store, selling all manner of goods to travelers and citizens alike. Now, this business appears to have been located at 504 Westport Road, and per kchistory.org, it is possibly the oldest still extant building in Kansas City. A Google search shows that it's now home of Bridger's Westport, the #1 hip-hop club in Kansas City, per their website. So that's kind of cool. A building that was once owned by Jim Bridger is still around, and you can go there and get your bump and grind on. In 1856, Bridger was able to send a fourth child, John, aged 4, to St. Louis for schooling, and he took a job himself as a guide for the eccentric Irish adventurer, Sir St. George Gore, the 8th Baronet of Gore Manor in Northern Ireland, which, once again, I'm not sure what it means, but it sounds rich as hell. And man, what a piece of work this Gore guy was. Dude set out, Bridger as his guide, with 40 servants. Cooks, stewards, wine servers, taxidermists, secretaries, even people who just made fancy special flies for his fishing rigs. 170 horses, oxen, and mules pulled 21 carts and 6 wagons full of 3 tons worth of equipment. Ammunition, a giant tent, chairs, the entire leather-bound works of Shakespeare, a bathtub, and an assortment of expensive greyhounds and foxhounds. Hell, one of the wagons carried nothing but guns. Gotta wonder what Bridger must have thought, especially considering that the baronet would sleep till noon every day. Sadly, during this trip, Jim would receive news that his son John had passed away in St. Charles of dysentery, and as such, Bridger cut the job short to return home to his remaining family. Remember, they're living in Westport while Bridger is spending the majority of his time out west. That summer of 1855, Jim returned to scouting for Gore. He was doing his level best to kill every animal he could find, just for the sake of killing. Some estimates put the number of buffaloes slaughtered by the Irishmen at an astounding 30,000, along with thousands of deer, elk, and over 100 grizzlies. His guides would either stampede the buffalo directly in front of Gore, or he'd just post up on a hill and wantonly drop one after another after another. So much so that an Indian agent complained to the government, but unfortunately no action was taken, and Gore would not return home to the Emerald Isle until 1857. Following this job, Bridger would go to work guiding for the nation's leading geologist, Ferdinand Hayden, and topographer Governor K. Warren, exploring the Yellowstone River and taking important geological samples and specimens. And other than Warren and Hayden nearly coming to blows, everything went swimmingly. Not so much down Utah way, however. Old Brigham Young was still down there in Salt Lake City, crazy as ever, making his holy proclamations and ruling like a theocrat. Actions that caused President Buchanan to go ahead and appoint a non-Mormon to the position of Utah Territory governor. He knew Young would never go for this, so the new governor, Alfred Cumming, was to be escorted by the by God U.S. military, which was guided by none other than my friend and yours, Jim Bridger. Now, I don't want to venture too far into the Utah War, because to be honest, I'm not very well versed on the subject. I will say that I do sympathize with the Church of Latter-day Saints and their desire to separate themselves from society and live their lives as they see fit. Boy, do I. I also like that Brigham Young was recorded as saying, "I love the government and the Constitution of the United States, but I do not love the damn rascals that administer the government." Amen, brother. I think the Mormons were legit persecuted for their religious beliefs. Also worth considering that the nation, even in the 1850s, was on the brink of war over the issue of slavery. The U.S. was truly a divided nation, even before the war between the states, but the one thing that everybody could agree on was hating the Mormons. So yeah, I get it, they were the easy choice. Not to say that Brigham Young was an innocent little altar boy. He was preaching a lot of seditious stuff and, as I said before, attempted to set up a theocracy. Religious beliefs are one thing, but we should all be free to worship as we see fit. A theocracy, however, would see a certain religion forced upon the populace. And since rulers like Brigham Young, for example, are considered chosen by God, you can't question their edicts because that would be just like doubting the Lord Almighty himself. I'm not a big fan of legislating morality, and turns out neither is the Bill of Rights or the entire history of mankind. It generally never ends well. Take the Mountain Meadow Massacre, for example, which sure as hell did not help Brigham Young's cause. In mid-September 1857, as Bridger was still guiding the first of the federal troops to Utah, members of a Mormon militia attacked and killed over 120 men, women, and children belonging to a passing wagon train. Only the kids under the age of 7 were spared. I think 17 in total. Now, there's no proof that I'm aware of linking Brigham Young to this massacre, officially, but even if he didn't order it, certainly his rhetoric and calls for blood atonement helped create an atmosphere where such an event could occur. Funny how that works, even nowadays. At this point, Brigham Young declares martial law and Mormons prepare for war, even briefly toying with the idea of a weapon of mass destruction, Game of Thrones style. I shit you not. A guy named Uriah Brown invented what he called liquid fire, and the plan was to have this stuff piped into the canyons and released on the invading U.S. military. In the end, not much came of this so-called war. Despite Young's boast, as soon as the military showed up, he stepped down and relinquished power to the U.S. appointed governor. The Mormons lost a lot of their federal power, but still remained in control of the local governments, courts, etc., and the nation at large considered the entire ordeal a joke. Buchanan's blunder, they called it. The troops, under the command of a Colonel Edwin Alexander, had departed Leavenworth, Kansas in mid-July 1857. Much later in the season than they should have, considering the slow, plodding pace of oxen-drawn wagons and the terrain that they would have to cross. 2 months later, in late September, Bridger was guiding the troops through the South Pass in Wyoming and down the Mormon Trail, Salt Lake City bound. With just over 400 miles to go, they could be expected to arrive no later than the end of October. This would not be the case, however. For whatever reason, the expedition halted at Ham's Fork, over 150 miles northeast of the Great Salt Lake. I say whatever reason, but they were beginning to face Mormon resistance. But mostly it was just a bloodless harassment, with Porter Rockwell and his legionnaires firing off guns in the air, out of rifle distance, and yelling insults. The less than stellar Colonel Alexander called a council, and Jim Bridger proposed an alternate route. They'd turn northwest to the Bear River, take the Oregon Trail to present-day Idaho, and then come to Salt Lake City from the north. This would take twice as long, yet the colonel agreed. I suppose out of concern with Mormon resistance, I don't know. The troops were soon mired down in a nasty snowstorm. They turned back, and the entire column was stopped for 10 days. At this point, a Colonel Johnston arrived, took over command, but it was too late. Winter had struck with a vengeance, and the army soon suffered more harassment at the hands of Mormons as well as a lack of supplies. All the while, Bridger was busy trying to just keep everybody from freezing and starving to death. Needless to say, the army did not make it to Salt Lake City for many months to come. It was a big waste of money and manpower, and Brigham Young ended up stepping down anyway. I still gotta think that old Jim got at least a little satisfaction out of seeing Young humbled, though. Something interesting occurred while Bridger was out west in 57 guiding for the army. A somewhat minor detail in the man's life that I think is worth mentioning. A slave was sold back in Jim's home in Westport, a transaction from which Jim was credited $420. Now, this happened while he was away, scouting for the army, like I said, but a couple of years prior, when a census recorder came to the Bridger home, there was an enslaved 20-year-old woman living there with 2 children. In March of 1861, a black woman was treated by a doctor at the Bridger home, possibly the same lady. Also interesting to note that the head of household in that census was a widow woman named Ruth Skaggs. She lived there with her 2 sons and Bridger's wife and children. I'm not sure how much English, if any, Jim's wife Mary could speak. Got to imagine she felt like a foreigner in a foreign land. And there are several reports of her wanting to return to the Fort Bridger area to be with her own people. Maybe this Ruth lady was there to assist Mary around the house. Maybe she was just a boarder. I don't know. Anyway, the question now posed is whether or not Jim Bridger was indeed a slave owner or if he supported slavery. We know his buddy Vasquez did own slaves for sure. Was the slave that was sold in 1857 someone that Vasquez had sent to the Bridger household to help out in Jim's absence? Was the selling of the slave just business that Bridger was conducting on behalf of his partner Vasquez, as he had previously done? Or was this just Bridger's slave? Who knows? Okay, take it easy. I'm not making some grand moral judgment or trying to pontificate. I do, however, think this is a great example of just how complicated and dirty history can be. Aspects like this can oftentimes be glossed over when discussing our heroes. Me personally, I think it's worth pointing out the good, the bad, and the ugly. We don't really associate slavery with the Mountain Man days, but I went down a little wormhole, and yeah, surprisingly, there were fur trappers who had slaves working in the Rockies. Different topic for a different day, though. Now, obviously, Bridger would go on to serve the Union Army, albeit on the frontier during the Civil War. Both his son and son-in-law would also serve the Union during the war, even as their own neighbors fought for the Confederacy. So I don't think Jim was a Southern sympathizer. I also don't think he had any strong feelings one way or the other as far as slavery was concerned. I would venture to say, though, that he was probably a little more open-minded than many, considering that his wives were all Native American, his children mixed, and many of his friends of varying ethnicities, including the former slave James Beckwourth. In 1859, Bridger was once more hired by the U.S. military, this time to guide an expedition to the headwaters of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers, an area that, despite being heavily traveled by mountain men and Native Americans, had not officially been mapped or scientifically explored since Lewis and Clark passed through over 5 decades prior. They were also under orders to determine the feasibility of wagon roads in the Powder and Bighorn River areas, and to map out the territory of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho and figure out, quote, the proper routes by which to invade their country and conquer them, end quote. Now, the leader of this expedition, a Captain William F. Reynolds, was often at odds with Bridger, thinking that his maps were better than those in the old trapper's brain. Time and again, Captain Reynolds would propose a route that Jim had to correct him on. Hell, even from the onset, Jim recommended the expedition use mules while the captain insisted on wagons. This, of course, slowed down travel as the terrain was rough and the party had to constantly raise or lower the wagons with ropes or use picks and shovels to make their own roads, something they could have avoided altogether with mules. Jim would return home that winter as news reached him that his third wife Mary had passed away. I was unable to determine a cause of death, but she was buried there in their front yard in Westport, as the aforementioned widow Ruth Skaggs became a caretaker of sorts for the younger children. Jim was 55 years old at the time of his wife's death, and he would not marry again. In the spring of 1860, Bridger rejoined Captain Reynolds, not far from Fort Laramie, and led the way west to the Wind River area, where once again Reynolds ignored his scout's advice and damn near got his men froze to death. After more than a few unsuccessful attempts at crossing the divide, Reynolds finally stopped being hard-headed and took Bridger's advice, using what's now known as Union Pass to cross over. Then came the Snake River, which was dangerously swollen due to snowmelt. This obviously not being Bridger's first rodeo, he suggested making a bull boat to cross over with. The captain, in his wisdom, rejected this idea and instead ordered his men to search for a good location to ford, a choice that cost the life of one of his corporals who was swept away by the current, his body never to be seen again. Instead of now taking Jim's advice on the bull boat, Reynolds ordered his men to construct a raft, because Reynolds knows best. When the raft was completed, the captain tries to cross the river in it, guided by a rope, and surprise, surprise, he is unsuccessful. Finally, after 2 days wasted and one soldier dead, Captain Reynolds puts his bruised ego to the side and asks Bridger to pretty please go ahead and make that bull boat. Jim does so, and all of the men are able to cross over without a single issue. Fun little fact, a bull boat is fabricated using a wooden frame or hoop of sticks, oftentimes willow, over which a green buffalo hide is stretched. The one Bridger slapped together on this occasion measured 12.5 feet long by 3.5 feet wide, made 17 successful crossings, each passage only taking 2 minutes. Jim would then lead the men over Teton Pass to Pierre's Hole, and by July 3rd, they had reached Fort Benton without making it to present-day Yellowstone National Park. Ugh. Believe it or not, even in the year of our Lord 1860, the world at large was still in denial about the wonders of Yellowstone. This fabled area was first described to Lewis and Clark by various tribes, but they themselves did not pass through. However, a few years later, John Coulter Wood did an episode on Old John a long time ago. It's on Patreon if you're interested. Coulter observed at least one geothermal in the northeastern portion of the park and described it as a place of fire and brimstone. Coulter's hell, as folks took to calling it, was dismissed as just a fishtail. Then came Jim Bridger and numerous other trappers, and they too told stories of what they saw: the boiling mud and steaming rivers, a mountain of glass and petrified trees with petrified birds singing petrified songs. It wasn't until 1869 that the area was formally explored with the Cook, Folsom, and Peterson expeditions. Turns out there were geysers and there were steaming rivers, and while the petrified birds singing petrified songs did not exist, the petrified trees certainly did. Now, to be honest, Bridger and his fellow trappers could tell some whoppers. Jim especially. If he felt like you didn't believe him, he would really start laying it on thick. I'm sure you're probably familiar with some version of the story that Bridger told about being surrounded by 100 or so Cheyenne warriors, or Lakota, or Blackfeet, or whatever tribe that Jim felt like inserting. He'd tell his spellbound audience that the angry warriors chased him into a box canyon that offered zero chance of escape. And to make matters worse, he was all out of shot for his rifle and completely surrounded. Jim would then pause, a long pause, until someone inevitably would blurt out, "And what happened then?" To which Bridger, straight-faced, would stoically reply, "Well, them Injuns killed me." Then there was the camping spot that Jim claimed was one of his favorites, right up against a bald, flat face of a mountain. He had the echo of the canyon timed to right at 6 hours, so just before turning in at night, Bridger would yell out, "Time to wake up." And sure enough, 6 hours later, his own echo would return to work as an alarm clock. And it wasn't just the forest and the birds that were petrified. There was a certain place where Bridger claimed that a Crow medicine man had put a curse on everything that crossed it to be petrified, even gravity. As proof, Jim claimed to have ridden his horse over petrified air. The animal, thinking that he could just do this everywhere, tried again on his own to show off to some other horses and fell to his death. Of the ordeal, Bridger allegedly said, quote, "He was a good, logical horse. Only thing that he didn't know was that in most places the law of gravity isn't petrified." End quote. So yeah, for your common pilgrim from back east who had a hard time even believing that the Rocky Mountains were as big as reported, these crazy stories coming out of the mouths of these wild, long-haired mountain men was just a bridge too far. Before the Reynolds expedition was complete, Bridger interceded in 2 would-be fights with the indigenous, both times calming hot tempers and avoiding bloodshed, just a pattern that continuously repeats itself. The dude just knew how to talk to the natives. In the spring of 1861, Jim went to Denver and met up with his longtime buddy, Jim Beckwourth, with the idea of getting together a group of old trappers to go hunting gold. I mean, hell, they ought to have known more than anyone else where the likely deposits were. Only reason they hadn't prospected before, according to Jim, was that in the old days, quote, beaver was the best paying gold they was. First, though, the coach and mail service hired Jim to lay out a direct stage route from Denver west through the Rockies, which he did. The new road cut more than 200 miles off the overland route, but it never materialized. And as far as I know, he and Beckwourth never did go panning for gold. Turns out there were more pressing matters at hand, and Bridger and Beckwourth weren't the only ones with prospecting in mind. Gold would soon be discovered along Grasshopper Creek in southwestern Montana. Boomtown of Bannock sprung up quickly as hopefuls flooded the area looking to strike it rich. Likewise, about 80 miles west, where gold was struck at Alder Gulch, resulting in another boomtown called Virginia City. It was like the California gold rush all over again, only this time the would-be miners were crossing right through the middle of Sioux territory in order to get to the diggings. As I'm sure you can guess, the Lakota weren't too happy about these developments. They and their allies struck back hard, closing down the new trail and causing the Army to send in Brigadier General Patrick Connor with orders to, quote, make vigorous war upon the Indians and punish them so that they will be forced to keep the peace. End of quote. And guess who the United States Army would call upon to guide such an operation? I'll give you a hint. Starts with a J and rhymes with M. Bridger. But would he be up to the task? I mean, hell, the man was nearing 60 years of age at this point. Would the Army be successful in protecting the prospectors? And just who was this William J. Fetterman guy anyway? In the summer of 1854, a second lieutenant, John L. Grattan, led a detachment of infantry into a combined Brule and Oglala Lakota village just east of Fort Laramie. It seems a visiting Miniconjou had killed a stray cow belonging to a passing wagon train, and its owner demanded justice. Okay, fine. Chief Conquering Bear offered up a horse as way of compensation, but no dice. The cow's owner wanted money, and the U.S. Army wanted an arrest, something that old Conquering Bear could not do. Not only did he have no authority over a member of another band, but it would have also been rude. I mean, the Miniconjou in question, after all, was Conquering Bear's guest. The entire affair was to be handled by the Indian agent per the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, and he was due to arrive in just a few days. Despite the short wait, the Army decided to act. That's where Second Lieutenant Grattan comes into play. He marched his 30 men, including a very drunk and rude French interpreter, into a camp containing an estimated 1,200 warriors and tried to arrest the alleged thief. You can probably guess how this turned out. The resulting battle, known as the Grattan Massacre, saw the lieutenant and nearly a dozen of his troops almost immediately cut down. Warriors, led by an up-and-coming Oglala in his early 30s named Red Cloud, overtook and finished off the remaining soldiers as they attempted to retreat. The whole bloody mess was over in a matter of minutes. A year later, several hundred soldiers under the command of Brigadier General William S. Harney would attack a Brule Lakota camp near present-day Llewellyn, Nebraska. This Battle of the Blue Water, aka the Harney Massacre, saw over 80 Lakota killed, half of which were women and children. An additional 70 prisoners were taken, almost all of whom were women and children. Some historians point to this event and the Grattan Massacre as being the impetus to the violence that would dominate the Great Plains over the next 25 years. Toss in a couple of broken treaties along with a few more massacres, and you better believe things were about to get real bloody. As a result, the United States military would soon be facing a determined foe unlike any previously encountered. By the spring of 1862, the Army once again came calling on old Jim Bridger, this time to guide a Colonel William Collins and his men as they attempted to protect the telegraph and relay stations from hostile Lakota. And by all accounts, Bridger got along well with the rank-and-file soldiers he worked with, often teasing or just plain taking the piss out of the younger troops. A store sutler at Fort Laramie during this time remembered that Jim was always very open to questions and that he answered all inquiries as honestly as he could, that he was both a great listener and a conversationalist. However, it was noted that Jim had very little patience for willful ignorance. Anytime somebody would say something that he felt was out of malice or just downright meanness, Bridger would simply curl up his mouth in a sneer and walk away. Per biographer Jerry Insler, Jim didn't like to sacrifice his feelings, intelligence, or personal pleasure when, quote, It was such an easy matter to walk away from a damn fool talking. End of quote, and a lesson I think would serve us all well to follow. Don't waste your breath or your time arguing with a damn hard-headed fool. Just do like Bridger and walk away. Colonel Collins' teenage son, Casper Collins, whom Casper, Wyoming is named after, traveled often with his father and was amazed at how many languages Bridger could speak. Per young Casper, Jim could talk a little French, Spanish, Shoshone, Crow, Bannock, Salish, Nez Perce, and Ute. And of course, he was fluent in the universal sign language of the plains. Now let me preface the rest of this episode with a disclaimer. The next 4 or 5 years of Bridger's life will be interwoven with the Lakota and their struggles. This puts me in a bit of a pickle, as I am planning on doing an entire series on the Lakota later this year. From the Grand Massacre to the Powder River Campaign, the Minnesota Uprising, Red Cloud's War, the Great Sioux War of 1876, Little Bighorn, Sitting Bull up in Canada, all the way to Wounded Knee. I want to cover it all and in detail. Due to this, and me not wanting to bore you with repetition, some of the events discussed on this episode will be summarized without going too far in depth. I'll explain what's happening and what Jim Bridger's various roles were, but if you're looking for a really deep dive into the Lakota, or the so-called Indian Wars in general, just know that that is coming soon. Now, in the last episode, we left off discussing gold. What Black Elk once described as that yellow metal that drives the whites crazy. Once the boomtowns of Bannock and Virginia City sprung up, prospectors began flocking to Montana in droves via a new road dubbed the Bozeman Trail. Now, this route, blazed by John Bozeman, broke off from the Oregon Trail near present-day Douglas, Wyoming, before veering north by northwest. It crossed the Powder River, skirted the east side of the Bighorn Mountains, and then turned sharply to the northwest, crossing the Yellowstone River and Bozeman Pass before finally reaching Virginia City. For those of you keeping track, this road passes right smack dab through Lakota and northern Cheyenne territory. And by the time 1864 came around, John Bozeman was looking to lead a major migration across this extremely dangerous trail. A mass influx of travelers that would stir these tribes into a fury and 100% for sure spark a war. Luckily, Jim Bridger figured out a solution, what would come to be known as Bridger's Trail. This would take travelers slightly more due west, crossing on the western side of the Bighorn Mountains, and instead of trespassing on Cheyenne and Lakota land, prospectors would be passing through the territory of the much more accommodating Crow and Shoshone. Bridger's Trail would then link back up with the Bozeman in present-day Montana on the Yellowstone, near where the town of Laurel now stands, and from there on it was smooth sailing. Okay, cool. Sounds like a great plan. Hell, even the Sioux knew about Bridger's Road, or the Blanket Road as they called it after Jim's old nickname. When the Lakota caught miners on the Bozeman Trail, they told them to turn their asses around and take the Blanket Road, or at least they did until they got tired of talking. That summer of 1864, Bridger himself would guide a train of some 400 wagons across his trail, only to be absolutely amazed at the sight of the boomtown of Virginia City, a place that was merely an untouched wilderness the last time he was in the area. Jim returned to Fort Laramie in August and was badly injured after being thrown from a horse. Keep in mind, he's now 60 years old. Fort Laramie records show that he was transported to the Fort Hospital, but this incident wouldn't slow Bridger down, at least not yet. By mid-September, he's guiding yet another wagon train up the Blanket Road, and contrary to what you may read, his trail did prove to be more popular than the Bozeman. All total, in 1864, it's estimated that 2,500 men and scores of women and children utilized the Bridger Trail as opposed to just 1,500 via the Bozeman. Sure, the Bozeman Trail offered more water and grazing for the animals, but at what cost? Still, people are hard-headed, and despite the dangers, and despite the Lakota now beginning to kill travelers, the gold miners persisted, as did the military, hoping to offer up protection. All of this just causing unnecessary strife. And then further south in Colorado, Shivington and his men executed the Sand Creek Massacre. This, coupled with the aggravation of the Bozeman Trail and other recent instigations, would ignite a full-on war as the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota vowed to defeat the whites and drive them from their territories altogether. Wagon trains raided, relay stations burned, men and women killed, children taken. The small town of Julesburg, Colorado was sacked, 14 soldiers from Fort Rankin were killed, and thus the Powder River Campaign of 1865 began. Jim had done his level best to stop things from getting out of control by introducing the Bridger Trail, but it was no use. The war was on, and the Army would now need a reliable guide. As such, Bridger would report to Fort Laramie in April of 1865, where, to his absolute disgust, he was greeted with the sight of a Cheyenne warrior's rotting corpse hanging from a noose. The dead man, a feller named Big Crow, had been captured for his alleged role in the attack on Julesburg. Then, when some of his fellow tribesmen killed a soldier a mile or so west of Fort Laramie, General Patrick Connor ordered that Big Crow be taken to the location of the soldier's death and strung up. The troops did as ordered, quickly erecting a gallows and placing Big Crow on the bed of a wagon, noose around his neck. They then drove the wagon out from underneath the Cheyenne, but he was quick enough to use the dang rope to shimmy up the crosspiece of the scaffolding. Eventually, a soldier had to climb up and wrestle with Big Crow until they both fell, and of course, the condemned man finally succumbed to the noose. And they just left him there hanging as a warning. A few weeks later, Bridger would guide a Colonel Thomas Moonlight and his 500 horse soldiers toward the Bighorn, hoping to locate a large camp of Cheyenne. They found sign, but ultimately returned to Fort Laramie without a fight. Upon arrival, Jim noticed 2 more natives, this time Lakotas, who had been placed under arrest with orders to hang and be left hanging, just like Big Crow. Bridger warned against this, saying that such a public and disrespectful display will only cause more deaths, but his word fell on deaf ears. And these new prisoners soon joined Big Crow, rotting and swaying right out there in the open. By late July, the military was ready for a big push. General Connor split his force of 2,500 plus men into 3 groups, with Bridger, now chief of scouts, personally guiding for Connor and his 800 soldiers and 185 wagons as they departed Fort Laramie. Now, the Powder River Campaign was interesting in that the military utilized a large force of volunteers. The largest group of volunteers, in fact, ever deployed against the hostiles, at least up to that point. In addition to General Connor's force, you also had 1,400 Missourians under Colonel Nelson Cole, 600 Kansians under Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Walker, and Captain Frank North and his Pawnee Scouts. Remember, cut me a little slack here, as this is not meant to be a full and thorough examination of the Powder River Campaign, just a look at Bridger's role as Chief of Scouts. Each morning, the now 61-year-old Jim would rise early, have a cup of strong black coffee, and a bit of jerky, and confer with the general. He would then ride out far ahead of the column, alone, as his fellow scouts rode the flanks. At night, Jim would return well after dark, have him another bite to eat, and then turn in. Rinse and repeat. Now, I don't want to diminish the skill or grit of the U.S. fighting man of that day and age, but for the most part, many of these young troopers and volunteers would have died out there on the prairie if left to their own devices. They'd get lost, drink some bad water, or not notice hostile sign and be cut down. This is not a reflection on them so much as their lack of experience out west. Bridger, however, an old man, was surviving such an environment alone on a daily basis with the same ease that you and I toss a load of laundry in the washer. Per one unnamed soldier serving in General Connor's command, quote, "I knew scores of hunters, scouts, and trappers of great and less repute, none of whom were worthy to sit at the same table with Jim Bridger. To me, the simplicity, the kindliness, and absolute trustfulness of his character marked him as a man above the common." End quote. And yet another remembered, quote, "Bridger seemed to know every foot of the way in the country we went through. He was a very shrewd man and rather rough. He understood the way of the Indians very well and seemed to be able to make friends even with the warriors." End quote. We're also left with the following tantalizing detail as to Bridger's firearm of choice during the campaign, with a soldier describing it as a, quote, "extraordinary double-barreled rifle with which he could plug the center at 500 yards offhand. He was one of the most unassuming men I ever saw, but when he said anything, he meant it." End quote. Now, I am no firearms expert, but I did consult with my buddy Garrett Levi from the 11 Bang Bang YouTube channel. This is just a guess, but Garrett thought possibly Jim could have been carrying a London-made Purdy express rifle, most likely in .50 caliber. It may have even fired a .58 or even a .62 caliber, but slugs that heavy would drop pretty damn fast to be hitting center at 500 yards. Then again, Garrett points out that these side-by-side double-barreled express rifles were also proof to take extremely hot charges of powder, which I reckon would aid in reaching out and touching something at a great distance. These bad boys were expensive, however, and similar rifles could be made by local gunsmiths for a bit cheaper. If you're into older firearms, flintlocks, and muskets, and just history in general, Do yourself a favor and subscribe to Garrett's channel on YouTube. 11 Bang Bang, 11 Bang Bang. Link in the show notes, and thank you, Garrett. Now, these young soldiers and volunteers Jim was guiding during the Powder River expedition, they thought the world of him. Hell, he was already a damn legend by the time many of them were born. Jim's boss, however, General Patrick E. Connor, did not share the same fond sentiments. The Irish-born officer was a veteran of not only the Civil War, but the Mexican-American and the Seminole Wars. And he wasn't brand spanking new to the American West either. It was he and his men in 1863 who committed the lesser-known Bear River Massacre. This occurred not far from present-day Preston, Idaho, and saw hundreds of Shoshones slaughtered. Numbers vary, but possibly somewhere between 250 and nearly 500. And as usual, many of those killed were women and children. This may have partly been the reason why Connor disliked Bridger. He knew the old man was close with the Shoshone, and as such, he often suspected Jim as being treacherous. There was one incident when, as they were about to enter into a canyon, the general turned to Bridger, patted his holstered sidearm, and threatened, quote, "Jim, if you lead me into an ambush, by God, you're the first who's going to die." Damn paper collar soldier is what Bridger referred to Connor as. Got to assume that the general was the beneficiary of many of Jim's scowls. Another reason Connor may have not cared for the mountain man was because Bridger was often sympathetic with the plight of the natives. He believed that they were actual humans, and in many ways Jim had more in common with the Native Americans, both in habits and beliefs, than the soldiers that he now guided. Connor couldn't understand that. Matter of fact, he had given his men the express order that they were absolutely not to take prisoners and were to kill any and all male Indians over the age of 12. Orders that he was forced to countermand once his boss found out and threatened to take his commission. Now, as far as their actual engagements with the hostiles, Bridger did locate a column of smoke that Captain Frank North and his Pawnees then determined was an Arapaho village. Most sources don't list Jim as being involved in the battle that followed, except for one, frontiersman and teamster Finn Burnett, who stated that Bridger led the column to the camp. Now, this fight, known as the Battle of Tongue River, saw the Arapaho put up a tough resistance, despite many of the warriors being away at the time raiding the Crow. As they tended to do, the men covered the women and children as they retreated before following suit. The Arapaho then regrouped and counterattacked, causing General Connor and his force to retreat. All in all, it is considered a U.S. victory, with the soldiers only losing 1 dead and 6 wounded, along with 1 dead Native American scout. The Arapaho lost somewhere between 30 to 60-something dead, and yes, of course, per usual, some of them were women and children. Now, the other 2 army units weren't doing nearly as well. Likely unbeknownst to Bridger, his son Felix was now serving nearby under Colonel Nelson Cole, and they were having one hell of a bad time of it, as were the men under Samuel Walker. Both officers suffered from incompetent scouts, and it was at least partly due to Bridger's expertise that Connor's mission wasn't also a total failure. And by failure, I mean the loss of life. In the eyes of the military, General Connor had still not performed up to snuff. Not only had he failed to punish the enemy sufficiently, but his original orders were inhumane and he lost around 1,000 horses. When it was all said and done, despite striking a blow against the Arapaho, Connor was reassigned to a different district altogether and replaced by Brigadier General Frank Wheaton. Once back at Fort Laramie, Jim was reunited with his son Felix, and according to a witness, was very displeased to see his son, quote, in the ranks of a common soldier. Now, whether Bridger's mood was due to his son's actual rank, or simply the idea of him out there putting his neck on the line for the army is anybody's guess. And just to further drive home the type of guy that Jim was, as he returned from Laramie, he hitched a ride, part of the way, in the back of a mail wagon with 2 soldiers who had just mustered out. And for the trip, here he was, this living legend, riding in the back of this wagon with these 2 young men, probably over half his age, and Jim was simply just one of the boys. They piled up hay 6 inches deep and placed their blankets over it and made a trip out of it. Along the way, they stopped at a roadhouse inn, and the owner recognized Bridger, immediately inviting him in for a meal in a room on the sleeve. Jim didn't budge, though, saying that he was traveling with these 2 soldier boys, and he bunks where they bunk, and he'll eat what they eat. And just like that, all 3 received room and board for free. And that's just the type of guy that Bridger was. He didn't put on no airs. He wasn't better than you or above you. Jim was just making his way in this world like all the rest of us. I don't know, I could be wrong, but I don't see General Connor traveling or acting in such a fashion. At Fort Kearny, Jim gave a very rare interview to a newspaper, the Kearny Semi-Weekly Herald, and said that he was of a mind to return to what he called his home in Fort Bridger and wake up his foes, meaning them damn Mormons. Guess he was still smarting over what they had done. He also pointed out that the military's method of moving men and supplies was quote-unquote simply absurd, and that he could do much better with a group of seasoned frontiersmen. The paper wrote, quote, "If they will let him select a party of men, he will follow the Indians week after week, faring as they do, and will eventually overtake and surprise their villages." End quote. Jim would return home to Westport, but not for long. There was a large council held at Fort Laramie in the summer of 1866, with 21 separate bands of Lakota, Arapaho, and Cheyenne coming in to discuss a treaty, but they couldn't agree on shit. Most of the chiefs left in disgust, with Red Cloud saying that he would never allow the whites to use the Bozeman Trail, not even if there's a fire. Oh, and by the way, Bridger's road to the gold diggings was almost completely dismissed by the military at this point. For whatever damn reason, they were determined to use the Bozeman Trail and protect the prospectors using it at all costs, despite it being the much more dangerous route. You just couldn't stop the damn fools from crossing Lakota and Cheyenne land. This was one of the things that Red Cloud was so angry about. You know, the tribes just did not want anybody passing through. Enter in Colonel Henry Carrington. He was tasked with heading into the heart of Lakota territory and raising a couple of new forts for the purpose of defending the travelers along the Bozeman. Bridger was called in to scout for the colonel, and they set off from Fort Laramie on June 17, 1866. 700 mostly untried and poorly equipped men, along with 226 mule teams, headed straight into the hornet's nest. And as would be a continuing trend, Jim's advice largely went ignored. Despite Bridger picking out a prime location for a new fort, the colonel instead chose a spot on the Little Piney, just east of the Bighorns in present-day Johnson County, Wyoming. An area that had ample grass and water but no timber, at least not any conveniently close by, which posed its own unique set of problems. This new fort was quickly erected and dubbed Fort Phil Kearny, named after the popular Union general who was killed in action a few years before at the Battle of Chantilly. And by mid-July, the Lakota had already made their presence known, sneaking away with over 170 head of livestock from the new installation. 20-some-odd soldiers gave chase, which is exactly what the warriors wanted them to do. In the end, 2 soldiers and 1 teamster were dead, with 5 wounded. The following day, the Lakota stole an additional 34 mules from a wagon train on the Bighorn River. About a week later, Bridger was guiding a Thomas Burroughs from Fort Phil Kearny to Fort Reno when he came across quite a bit of Indian sign pointing towards Crazy Woman Creek. Investigating that night, Jim found what remained of a small detachment of soldiers who had been attacked earlier that day. 10 enlisted men, along with 5 officers, 3 women, and several children. Lieutenants Templeton and Daniels had ridden ahead to hunt for buffalo when they were attacked, with Daniels being killed. A wounded Templeton made it back to the wagons and circled them, and the fight was on. The chaplain for Fort Phil Kearny, Reverend David White, was present, and as several people began praying, he grabbed a rifle, supposedly saying, quote, "There is a time for praying and a time for fighting. Now stop praying." They put up a fight indeed until they were down to just a few rounds per man, at which point they had some hard decisions to make, namely who would be the designated hitter for the women and children. You've likely heard the old trope about saving that last bullet for yourself, right? The idea being that a quick death is better than what would await you if you're taken prisoner by the hostiles. The same consideration was given to women and children back in those days, and I get it, but man, not a job I would have liked to have had. Luckily, that evening around dusk, before any drastic measures were taken, the beleaguered holdouts spotted a solitary rider coming straight towards them, old Jim Bridger himself. The scout entered into the encircled wagons among cheers and let the survivors know that help was on the way. Worth noting that Captain Burroughs had initially dismissed Jim's claims of Indian sign. Had Bridger not pushed on to investigate, God only knows what would have happened to those soldiers and civilians. In August, Carrington sent Bridger to scout out an area for an additional fort, this one to be on the mouth of the Bighorn, just a few miles from where Jim had rafted Bad Pass over 4 decades prior. Dubbed Fort C.F. Smith, this post was about 100 miles northwest of Fort Kearny in present-day Montana. And as the post was being constructed, Jim was also tasked with shortening the road from there to Virginia City, leading a small wagon train as he did so. Along the way, they came upon 3 dead miners, all riddled with arrows. Once in Virginia City, Bridger agreed to speak with the Montana Post and once again asserted that he and his buddies could end these hostilities in no time flat if just given the means. Yet another dig at the way the Army was handling business. Bridger also took the time to call on his old friends, the Crow, surprised to find out that they had already been paid a visit by Red Cloud and his people. Not only had Red Cloud and his Sioux visited the Crow, but they were making the rounds to all the tribes, past enemies included, attempting to form an alliance and drive the whites out for good. And some among the Crow were interested, either in fighting for the Sioux or the whites, whichever side could assure them that they'd regain control of the Powder River country. Bridger talked some of the Crow leaders into coming with him to Fort C.F. Smith to speak with the commander, and he also rushed ahead to send news both to Carrington and the commander of Fort Laramie, Major James Van Vost, letting them know that they needed to act fast as the hostiles were assembling on the tongue and meant to do what Jim described as mischief. Van Vost especially doubted the old trapper, saying that he, quote, exaggerates about Indians. Jim then returned to Fort Smith, having shortened the road to Virginia City by 20 miles and securing the loyalty of the Crow, for the moment at least. By October, he was headed back to Fort Kearny at the request of Carrington. Once again, I don't want to go into too much detail here, as I will be repeating myself in a few months, and if you're a long-time listener, you've already heard this story. Check out the Fetterman fight episode on the Wild West Extravaganza Patreon if you're interested in more details. But earlier, I did mention the lack of timber around Fort Kearny. This meant that woodcutting details had to be sent out miles away, and whenever they left the safety of the fort, they were attacked, almost as a daily occurrence. The horizon sparkled from the glint of signal mirrors constantly. The enemy was waiting on them at all times, as the soldiers' every move was watched and reported. Skip ahead to November 3rd, 1866. Captain William J. Fetterman arrives with an additional 63 troops and immediately begins boasting about whipping the entire damn Sioux nation. Others there at Kearny echo his sentiments, namely a Captain Frederick Brown and Lieutenant Francis Grummond. Fetterman receives permission to conduct an ambush shortly after arriving. He leaves a few mules picketed outside the fort as a trap, but the Lakota don't take the bait, instead opting to make off with a herd of cattle about a mile away. There's more dissent in the ranks of Fort Kearny. Accusations are levied, tensions are high. By this point, the soldiers have withstood something like 50 attacks and lost around 20 men, including civilians. There were continued urgings for something to happen. Somebody needed to take the offensive to bring the fight to the hostiles. In early December, this was attempted. A wood detail came under attack about 4 miles away from the fort, and Captain Fetterman was sent to help with a company of cavalry. Even Colonel Carrington mounted up, looking to lead by example as he set off with a squad of mounted infantry. His plan was to circle his detachment around and cut off the Lakota retreat. During all this excitement, Lieutenants Grummond and Bingham, along with several soldiers, were separated from the main force and attacked. Grummond made it out alive, but Bingham did not. His body and that of a sergeant were found hours later, heavily mutilated. An additional 4 soldiers were wounded as the Lakota led them into an ambush. The tactic was simple. You lure your prey away with an easy target, perhaps 1 or 2 warriors who take off running. The soldiers would pursue, only to top a hill or round a corner, and oh boy, now you're surrounded. Seems easy enough to train against, but it just happened over and over again. Hell, it's a tactic still used by guerrilla fighters to this day. Of this debacle, Carrington admitted that the war with the natives required, quote, the utmost caution. As far as Bridger was concerned, he voiced his own opinion, saying that these soldiers didn't know anything about fighting Indians. And, let's face it, he was right. Following the end of the Civil War, a majority of your experienced troops mustered out. These young soldiers heading west were mostly raw recruits on their first deployment, and poorly trained at that. Some of the men, NCOs or the officers like Fetterman, were accomplished combat veterans. But fighting Johnny Reb down in Georgia was a whole lot different than facing the Great Plains warriors. Like fighting apples when you're used to punching oranges. Once again, word came that the Crow were becoming wishy-washy, so Bridger was sent back to talk with them. He arrived at Fort C.F. Smith in late November, and his stories were once more doubted by those in command. Just an aging mountain man living on his past accomplishments. Even the government back east was blind to the threat, or at least they claimed to be. In the State of the Union address of 1866, President Andrew Johnson boasted, quote, Treaties have been concluded with the Indians who have unconditionally submitted to our authority and manifested an earnest desire for a renewal of friendly relations." End quote. I guess nobody told Crazy Horse or Red Cloud because they had an earnest desire, all right, but it weren't for a renewal of friendly relations. Things finally came to a head on December 21st, 1866, when Bridger was still at Fort C.F. Smith. Like I said, I'm not going to go into great detail, but once more the soldiers were lured outside of Fort Kearny to once again come to the aid of a wood detail. Captain Fetterman is often quoted as saying, "Give me 80 men, and I will ride through the whole Sioux Nation." Whether or not he truly uttered these words is debatable, but on December 21st, he got exactly 80 men. Fetterman and his command were given explicit orders to not cross or pursue hostiles over Lodge Trail Ridge. They did so anyway and were summarily slaughtered, each and every damn one of them. This fight of the 100 in hand, also known as the Fetterman Massacre, was at that time one of the greatest defeats the U.S. military had ever suffered. Colonel Cook blamed Colonel Carrington, with Carrington then passing the buck onto the now dead Fetterman. A lot of accusations were thrown about, lots of finger pointing, and I will get to all of that in detail when I cover the Lakota Wars. Fact of the matter is, many mistakes were made by many different people. If the Army had just steered the prospectors towards Bridger's Trail instead of insisting on the Bozeman, perhaps things would have been different. Likewise, if the military had built Fort Phil Kearny where Bridger recommended, instead of miles away from their only source of timber. And what if the military commanders had paid closer attention to Jim's advice when it came to fighting the hostiles? You learn from those who know, right? Per one soldier, quote, "James Bridger was with us all the summer of 1866, up until late in the fall. If Colonel Carrington and the officers had followed the advice of Bridger, I do not think there would have been nearly as many of our men killed. He told the officers not to follow the Indians and to send more men on escort duty, but they thought he was old and did not know anything about Indian warfare." End quote. Can somebody who was in the military please explain this to me? What is the thought process here with officers when there's a guy like Jim Bridger, clearly experienced? The man had been living out there at this point for, 45 years? And he was still alive. He may have not known how to read or write. He may have looked like an old farmer, but the man was a damn survivor. Why would you pay no heed to his words? Why? What have you learned in a book that is better than what this man has already in his head? Yeah, it just frustrates me. By this point, Bridger's health was starting to decline, though I don't know, maybe that had something to do with it. That fall he took from the horse a while back was catching up with him, as was old age, and he wasn't able to get around as quickly as he once could. Also, his eyesight began failing him. He was joined at Fort C.F. Smith by Mitch Boyer, a young mixed-blood man, his father a French fur trapper and his mother a Santee Sioux. And Mitch was sort of a protege of Jim's, soaking up all that knowledge and experience. He's another guy I'd like to cover on a future episode. In June, Bridger returned to Fort Kearny, blazing yet another trail, as he did so, known as Bridger's Cutoff, a route that found its way on military maps that very summer. He was also joined by his friends the Crow, and by the end of the month, there were more than 1,800 of them camped around the fort. Still, though, not everybody welcomed Bridger. The new commander of the Mountain District, Colonel John Smith, said that the old scout was not needed, and furthermore, he paid no heed to rumors about attacks. A silly comment considering that the Lakota then proceeded to conduct several raids on and around the fort, culminating in the famous wagon box fight on August 2nd of 1867. Jim Bridger, still not feeling his usual pert self, took a temporary discharge in September to quote-unquote recuperate from what was described as an enfeebled condition. But he returned to duty in the spring of 1868 and guided 3 companies in building a road from the new Fort Fetterman to Medicine Bow. Red Cloud's war was winding down, but it was a total loss for the Army. The first war ever lost by the U.S. military. The Army would end up abandoning the Bozeman Trail completely, along with the forts that they had built, including Kearny. From May to July of 1868, Bridger assisted in these efforts, guiding General Henry Morrow along with over 200 wagons. Just doing what he had always done. Keeping an eye out for ambushes, choosing safe spots to camp, steering men and animals clear of poisonous water, finding safe river crossings, you name it, etc., etc. Per Finn Burnett, quote, "He seemed to never forget a trail that he had ever traveled, or the distance between streams or watering places, whether good water or bad, and also whether or not there was wood and if there was good feed for the stock. So we always knew what sort of camp the one ahead would be and what kind of country we would travel over in order to reach it." End quote. On July 21st, 1868, at 64 years of age, Jim Bridger was finally discharged from military service for the final time. Still wasn't ready to retire, though. Oh no. In February of '69, Bridger offered up the idea of him becoming the new Indian agent to the Crow. His nomination was formally approved by General Sherman, but ultimately the job went to another, younger man. Meanwhile, Jim's eyesight was progressively worsening. He was far from destitute, however. Bridger had barely even touched the money that he received from the Army, and over the years he had acquired a few properties around Westport and New Santa Fe, which he now began selling for a profit. Except for one. In April of 1872, he deeded his 287-acre farm to his daughter Virginia, charging her a whopping $1, and the quote, "love and affection I bear towards her as my daughter," end quote. Now nearly blind, Bridger stayed close to home and tended to his prized apple orchard, often sending bushels of apples to his neighbors. His claims about Yellowstone were also vindicated. The area was finally officially explored, the geysers and other wonders quote-unquote discovered, and even the Kansas City Journal printed an official apology to Jim Bridger. Editor Robert Van Horn wrote that he, quote, "heard from Bridger's own account of those wonders and had written it out for publication but had suppressed it because some of his friends laughed at it as utterly incredible," end quote. Jim's son Felix died in 1876, just 25 days after Custer and his men, including Bridger's protege Mitch Boyer, were wiped out up there on the greasy grass. James was 72 years old when he buried Felix. He had already outlived 3 wives and 4 children, and many of his friends. Of the remaining 3 kids, you had Virginia, Mary Elizabeth, and his youngest William. By the late 1870s, Bridger could only recognize people by the sounds of their voices, but he still got around with a heavy walking cane and even went riding his favorite horse on occasion. He'd tell Virginia to go saddle old Ruff for me. I feel like riding the farm, and he would, letting Ruff pick his way with his dogs trailing behind. If Jim ever got turned around, something that never happened when he was younger, he would just sit there on the horse waiting while the dogs ran back home barking to fetch help. Bridger still loved to tell stories. He would walk to town often, feeling his way with his cane, and one of the locals claimed that Jim could still out-talk 7 men. And even the children would come and sit on the porch and listen to his yarns. "I shall always remember Bridger's kindly blue-gray eyes," said a woman who was around 10 or 12 when she knew the old trapper. Quote, "I would often go see Mr. Bridger. He was always very hospitable and liked to have the children of the neighborhood come to see him. His son Bill played the violin, and the whole neighborhood used to come to dance at the Bridger home. I often saw him riding on horseback or walking over his land, feeling his way along with his stick, accompanied by 2 or 3 of his foxhounds. If they startled a rabbit, the old man would get greatly excited and ahoo the hounds onto the chase." End quote. Despite his age and eyesight, Jim was anxious as ever to live out west, declaring that he would not stay east for another day if he could only have use of his eyes. Often while sitting on the porch, Bridger would stare towards the west and say, quote, "I wish I was back among the mountains again. You can see so much further in that country." On July 17, 1881, the great Jim Bridger passed on to the other side at 77 years of age. A life, I think, that was well lived. One that saw a tremendous, almost unbelievable amount of change. When Jim was a young man first going up the Missouri River, the entire western half of what's now the United States was a wilderness. There were no stores, no post offices, no doctors, no lawyers or teachers or police officers. When Bridger was a child, there were founding fathers and veterans of the American Revolution still alive. Thomas Jefferson wouldn't die until Jim was in his 20s. When Bridger did head west, the Great Plains teemed with millions upon millions of shaggy bison, and by the time he died, these animals were all but extinct. Likewise with the indigenous, both friends and enemies. The Blackfeet are a perfect example. They were the cocks of the walk, the baddest of the bad, a formidable foe that put many of Jim's pals under. Yet by the time Bridger departed the mountains, they were but a nub of what they once were, decimated by disease and plagues, an economy and government they did not understand, Even the Lakota were done, despite their last hurrah from the mid-1860s to the late 1870s. By the time of Bridger's passing, Crazy Horse was gone, Red Cloud was on the reservation, and even Sitting Bull would finally surrender, just 2 days after Jim's death. Bridger passed through modern-day Denver before there was so much as a log cut or a nail driven. Likewise with Casper and Jackson and Billings and Bozeman. From Bismarck to Salt Lake City, Jim Bridger saw it all when it was still wild and free and untamed. Yet at his passing, all of these lands were crisscrossed by railroad tracks, fencing, and barbed wire. It had all been parceled out, claimed, dug up, and built upon. Church bells now rang in lieu of beaver tails slapping the water, and prisons and jails sprung up where the only law once was what a man could enforce with his own fists and rifle and blade. A man who could neither read nor write, who once helped power a keelboat up the Missouri River with pure muscle and guts, saw the coming of the steamboat, the telegraph, and even the damn telephone. Hell, Jim Bridger even outlived Billy the Kid by a total of 3 days. His son William would pass away from consumption 6 years later in 1887, and daughter Mary Elizabeth died in 1922 from heart trouble. Virginia lived the longest, not dying until 1933. Matter of fact, she lived long enough to go see the movie The Covered Wagon in theater, where her father was portrayed by actor Tully Marshall. Virginia was not happy with it, though, as the movie Jim Bridger was a heavy drinker who lived with 2 Indian women at the same time. Paul was never like that, Virginia scoffed, before filing a $1 million lawsuit against the production company. A suit that was ultimately overturned due to Jim already being long dead. Oh, and by the way, the Bridger estate was finally paid for Fort Bridger, a whopping $6,000. And that's about all I've got on the great Jim Bridger. What a life. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned a little something. I know I did. Thank you so much for listening. I know I say this all the time, but it means the world to me. Really does. Next up, we will be taking a look at a relatively unknown character from the Old West. A young man, hang on a second, let me make sure I'm pronouncing this name correctly. A young man named William Bonney? I don't know, I've barely heard of him. Maybe you have, but that's what's coming up next. After this episode you're listening to right now, there will be 1 or maybe 2 weeks of downtime, but then we coming back, baby, with a full-on Billy the Kid series. I don't know about you, but I am pee my pants excited. Till then, stay safe, check out the podcast To Be a Rebel and 100 Proof History, and definitely check out to see what my friend Michael over at Texas History Lessons is up to. The Lord's work, that's what he's doing. Thanks again, everybody. Till next time, adios. Hey, we'll get back to the story in just a moment, but first, I gotta be honest with you. I'm doing this full time now. The Wild West Extravaganza is, as we speak, my job. And to tell you the truth, this is sort of a gamble. I'm gambling on myself, and I'm gambling on you. To make this work, and to continue bringing you true tales from the wild and woolly West, in an unfiltered and uncensored fashion, I'm gonna need your support. And at this moment, the absolute best way you can support the Wild West Extravaganza is by becoming a member of Into History. Into History is a podcast subscription channel made by history lovers for history lovers. Not only will you get to listen to the Wild West Extravaganza ad-free, but you'll gain early access before anyone else. You'll also get bonus content. There is currently Wild West Extravaganza content on Into History that you cannot hear anywhere else, not even on Patreon. And there's a lot more to come. You'll also get to participate in the book club, the community forum, the upcoming live streaming events, and best of all, you won't have to hear my annoying ass voice break into the middle of a story like I'm doing right now. And guess what? You also get everything I just mentioned from all the other shows in the Into History universe, offering the same perks. Come on, what are you waiting for? Go to intohistory.com/Wild West Extra. That's intohistory.com/Wild West Extra to become a member today. I love you, and thank you very much for assisting me in helping to keep the Old West alive. Back to the show. not even if there's a fire.